David Patrick Harry. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm good, brother. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So I did a video last year called "Everyone Has Something to Say About Jesus," and it's the very last episode of a series of videos on an apologetic for Christianity.
hmm
And so I kind of gave my case for Christianity, and then I went into why not Judaism, why not Islam, why not these other Far Eastern religions. And admittedly, I knew less about the Far Eastern religions than the others.
hmm
And so that's why I wanted to interview you, because you've got a little bit of a background in that.
Right.
And yeah, so I wanted to break that down and kind of give a more extensive apologetic against those faiths and compare and contrast them with Orthodoxy. So for people who don't know you, would you mind giving yourself a little introduction with Church of the Eternal Logos
Sure.
and what your background and experience with those Far Eastern religions would be?
Sure. My name's David Patrick Harry. I have a YouTube channel, one by my name, and then a second one called Church of the Eternal Logos, which is not a church. I'm an Orthodox Christian scholar. I have a PhD in religious studies, and this will connect with the Eastern religions. But my YouTube channel, Church of the Eternal Logos, is really about commenting on history, cultural topics, theological discussions from an Orthodox Christian perspective. So it's not a church. It's really just hearing a discussion about a wide range variety of topics from an Orthodox Christian perspective. And so I am completing my PhD right now in religious studies, and my focus has generally been in new religious movements or Western esoteric traditions. So religious studies is more of the academic, pretty much secular approach to the study of religion as a historical phenomenon. So it's not a seminary degree. It's not theology per se. And during my undergrad, I was a double major in religious studies and biology and became very enamored with Eastern mysticism. And so I grew up as sort of a conservative Protestant in a Methodist church. And when I got to college, began to take the first course I took was a critical course on the Bible. And I thought, as a naive Protestant Christian, oh, this is going to be a wonderful course to learn more about Scripture. And then I learned about the multiple authorship theories of the Gospels, the correlations between the Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah, and all these different academic approaches to Scripture. And it really shook my sort of naive Christian faith. And at the time, studying science is very, easy to become a sort of materialist atheist. And that lasted probably a few months. But then I took an intro course on world religions and learned about Hinduism and Buddhism, Daoism, Confucianism, and Daoism and Buddhism in particular were very interesting to me. I enjoyed the aesthetics, some of the mystical, philosophical, theological elements of those traditions. And so I ended up getting a academic certificate in Mandarin Chinese and spent 2 summers in southern China at Zhongshan Dashui or Sun Yat-sen University. And that was partly because at the time I was competing in Korean martial art, Taekwondo. And I was fascinated with Eastern mysticism, and I was taking these college courses. And I thought, man, if I want to really get at the heart of martial arts in the East, I need to go to China. And that kind of prompted me to do that. And during that period, I was getting into sort of Alan Watts, Terence McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson, Timothy Leary, and started to experiment with psychedelics in light of a sort of spiritual but not religious, New Age, Eastern mystical approach. So that colored much of my 20s, and eventually went and got a master's degree at the University of Illinois in religious studies, and that focus was on early Christianity and then psychedelic shamanism within native traditions. So I was interested at that point in sort of Hermeticism. I think that may come into our conversation today, but Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and all these other gospels that most Christians aren't aware of. So there's technically 52 books that are attributed to Jesus, 4 of which are the Synoptic Gospels in Scripture, 48 of which are referred to as Gnostic scripture. And there's a book, the Nag Hammadi Library, that has all those books, and they present a very different understanding. It's a totally different paradigm. It's not Christian. It's a mixture of Neoplatonism, mystical practices, all this different stuff. So eventually, that fascination took me to Berkeley, California to do the PhD. And initially, I was going to study people who are spiritual, not religious, and look at the ways in which they appropriate symbols. So it's very common, certain Buddhist heads or the yin yang symbol or, Shiva or Krishna or various Hindu deities. And I was curious, like, why do people choose certain symbols? And that eventually morphed into me doing a research paper on a book called The Psychedelic Gospel. Right here, it's by Dr. Jerry Brown and his wife Julie, in which they document the existence of these frescoes, specifically within Western Europe, that appear to present the Eucharist as a psychedelic mushroom. And diving into that whole thing, and at the time being very interested in psychedelics and a practitioner, if you will, that led to me coming to the realization that all these frescoes from basically the 900s to the late 1200s are historically contextualized. And this was during the appearance of the Cathars. It's a Gnostic heresy that emerged in Southern Europe, parts of Germany, Southern France, Northern Italy, around that area. And the Albigensians were part of this group. Of course, the Inquisition eventually squashes them out, and doing that research led to me thinking, oh, wow, well, Christianity, I wonder if I could find more of these mushrooms and these psychedelic frescoes if I looked into Eastern Orthodoxy, because they have all these icons. And that led into me taking a PhD course on the history and theology of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and was a non-believer at the time. Incredibly fascinating course that altered my worldview. Still a non-believer by the end of the semester, but I thought, man, if I was going to adopt a religious worldview, because at that time, being spiritual, not religious, religion, those are institutions made by man, and spirituality, well, this is the authentic experience that these institutions, the hierarchical institutions of power, are trying to prevent. But if I were going to join a religion, it would be Eastern Orthodoxy, and it had to do with the Logos theology, and part of that's going to come into play when we do the apologetic approaches to sort of these Eastern mystical traditions. But after a few months that sitting in, I became eventually convinced that Orthodoxy was not just a ideological, theological system to admire, but it was actually the truth. And a few months later, eventually started attending Orthodox churches, and about a year later, becoming a catechumen in the Orthodox Church. So I've been Orthodox I've been attending since 2018, and then officially a member since early 2020. Yeah, the COVID epidemic pushed everything back. So anyways, that's me. And so my dissertation, I just completed it. That was actually on transhumanism. So bridging the history of Western esoteric traditions, the history of Western magic, essentially, with new religious movements. I looked and analyzed the differences in concepts of deification. So when we discuss orthodoxy, we'll be bringing up the concept of theosis, which is the central doctrine of how we become like God, and how we engage with God and how we embody the uncreated energies. And so it's a form of deification. God became man so that we can become God. And I'm comparing that with transhumanism as a form of technological deification that uniquely comes out of Western Christianity out of the 800s. So during the Carolingian Renaissance, John Scotus Erigena began to associate technology as being the redemptive grace of God, and that through technology we would restore ourselves back to prelapsarian perfection. So essentially back to the state of Adam and Eve before the fall. And that's what I just wrote about. So my focus, and much of my academic focus for the last 2.5 years, has been on tackling transhumanism, categorizing that as a religious, post-secular religious movement. Post-secular just is a term academics use to describe the collapsing of the dialectic between the religious and the secular, which the Enlightenment has kind of created this dialectic. This is why we have secular societies and all this stuff. But with the postmodern turn, we also have a post-secular turn in which secular narratives and secular ideologies essentially function as religions within the postmodern period. And so that delineation between communism being an ideology or Christianity being a religion, these things is kind of antiquated, at least within contemporary scholarship. So I use that framework to essentially analyze transhumanism as a contemporary form of deification amongst people that claim to have no religious sentiments, but are attempting to fulfill the religious yearnings through technology. So long-winded answer to the introduction, but that should give you a little bit more insight onto who I am.
Yeah, awesome. You're not the only person that I've heard that's had a kind of that path to orthodoxy. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Nathan Jacobs. He's also had kind of that. He was, I think he was Lutheran, and then he got into lots of psychedelics and LSD and interesting things. And
Yeah.
he has a very interesting story. So, and then I had another friend actually at the same church that had a similar story. So it's there is a pipeline from like Far Eastern mysticism and also psychedelics to orthodoxy. It's very interesting.
Well, and I think that was going to be part of our conversation today, because I think there is a reason why orthodoxy in particular is so appealing to people coming out of Eastern mysticism or psychedelics or the New Age, or any sort of these mystically oriented subjective experience spiritualities. Because Orthodoxy it's the mystical church, according to Lasky, the mystical church of the East. It is the mystical theology of, if you want to divide Christendom into denominations, Orthodox, we don't like that. But if you were to, we would say we are the most and explicitly mystical form of Christianity. And so if somebody's interested in experience, which we do, our hierarchy of knowledge begins with revelation, faith, which incorporates subjective personal experience, and then rationalism. So orthodoxy appeals to really the postmodern turn in the sense that it values subjective human experience, because this is the way that we engage with God. But it doesn't, unlike postmodern, it does not reject the historical metaphysical tradition, which allows for objective knowledge and scientific methods, empiricism, and all this different stuff. So I think orthodoxy, and this is something that Christos Giannaros, he's a reposed now, but he was a Greek theologian. One of the things that he argues is that postmodernism is actually an opportunity for the Orthodox Church, because within postmodernism, it's the recognition that modernity has failed. And modernity is a term really just to describe the intellectual project from the Enlightenment forward. And really, you could argue from the Renaissance forward, but really from the Enlightenment forward. And so modernity is filled with these understandings of technological progress leading towards both the moral perfection of people, but in the societal perfection as well. In the 20th century, with World War II, World War I, World War II, and all the atrocities, more people died in the 20th century than any century before. So the idea that modernity was going to save us, this is what postmodernism is recognized. Postmodernism is saying that the project of modernity has failed. And orthodoxy would also agree with that, because modernity is a project that's built on presuppositions that don't begin with God or Christianity specifically. It begins with human reason. And so man is elevated essentially to a status of divine authority within that sort of post-enlightenment structure. And so orthodoxy is saying, well, why don't we just return back to the pre-modern world, or a pre-modern paradigm before modernity, where postmodernism is saying modernity failed, therefore we need to scrap everything and begin a totally new project. And that's where they promote epistemological relativism, total subjectivity. Everybody has their own truth. There are no universal narratives. And so Giannaros thought, and he wrote this in the Metaphysics of Postmodernism, or Postmodern Metaphysics, he argues this is actually an opportunity for orthodoxy to take hold in the West, because since modernity failed, some of the presuppositions of Western Christianity have failed. Therefore, it offers space for orthodoxy to fill in that gap and bring people back to a sort of pre-modern worldview in which subjective experience and rational objective knowledge are unified. These aren't two separate domains.
Very interesting. So just for people at home to keep things very simple, anytime I'm referring to Far Eastern religions, I'm talking about specifically Hinduism, Buddhism, Daoism, and Confucianism.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be most of the subject of tonight's discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Today, whenever you're listening to this, lovely people at home. So that being said, can you give a basic overview of those four religions? I know that's kind of a broad question. Can you give like a TLDR, like what these religions are? What do they believe? You can be as, I know I said TLDR, but you can give as much or as little you think is necessary for people to understand kind of what's going on in them.
Right. So before maybe deconstructing some of these traditions, we'll just give a sort of a brief introductory overview. So this is not totally holistic. There are certainly maybe aspects that I'm leaving out, but And you're right to describe these Eastern religions by these big four. I think the other one that's usually included can sometimes be Shintoism, but Shintoism is a nature religion that's unique to Japan and the island of Japan. So it doesn't have the same historical impact that these four traditions have. And so out of the four, and when we go through today and ask questions, I'm going to go through the same progression. So Hinduism, then Buddhism, then Daoism, then Confucianism. And so Hinduism is the oldest. And some people, when they hear Hinduism, they think of like the million gods, the polytheism, and rightfully so. But Hinduism is not one unified thing. Hinduism is really a term the British use to describe the variety of religious practice within the subcontinent of India. And so Hinduism, what we call Hinduism, and the contemporary religious practices of India are built upon what are called the Vedas and the Vedic tradition. And the Vedas are part of the Indo-European settlement that founded, or essentially dominated the Indian subcontinent roughly between the periods of like 1500 to 500 BC, so before Christ, so a while ago. And this is where you get the Vedas, like the Rig Veda and the Sama Veda, the Yura Veda. And these Vedas are focused on sort of ritualistic sacrifice and the worship of three particular gods: Indra, Agni, and Soma. Agni is a fire god. Soma is a deity that has led to much speculation, at least in the psychedelic world, because it's some type of intoxicating beverage that the priests, the Brahmins, would drink, and they would be able to commune with Soma. And so many connections, and the Veda actually speaks of Mithra. And so there's been many connections between Mithra and Soma, and Mithraism is a sort of psychedelic cult. Hinduism is really the term to describe these practices, which are focused on uniting with Brahman, which is the ultimate concept of unification. And so Hinduism, at least from our Orthodox perspective, calls into question the objectivity and the reality of existence itself, because they believe in a concept called moksha, meaning that everything is actually an illusion. And so what you're experiencing right now as a person within space-time is really a sort of illusionary experience to aid the Atman, the soul, and its journey through reincarnation, the cycle of samsara, back to unification with Brahman. And this is the whole point of creation. And creation goes through these thousands of years periods called the Yuga cycle. I think right now we're in the Kali Yuga. But anyways, Hinduism, and there's so many different ways to practice Hinduism, and much of contemporary India, the families are divided into contemporary cults. So they might be Shivites. That means they worship Shiva as the preeminent emanation or avatar of ultimate reality. And so this is where Hinduism is so divided, because these different cults utilize different avatars, and avatars are sort of presentations, embodiments, emergent embodiments of the divine, and the divine then emerges in various ways. But this is to not be confused with the incarnation of Christ, because no Hindu would argue that the avatar is taking on human nature or redeeming all of human nature. That's not the point. They're just presenting themselves, often through apparitions, or in some cases they believe that they're historical people, to convey some type of wisdom. So Hinduism, it's really about ritualistic practices to take the soul, and devotional practices to take the soul back towards complete union with Brahman. And so some of the terms that are notorious when talking about Hinduism, I didn't want to get too much into all the Sanskrit, because when you open up the bag of these religions, there's so many words and concepts that maybe sound kind of hard to grasp. The first one is Dharma. So Dharma, these are dharmic religions. So if you're talking about Hinduism, Buddhism, or Jainism, Jainism is another, it's an absolute nonviolent religion within India. These are called dharmic religions. It has to do with this idea that there's a cosmic law, or there's a moral order in the world, and that then individuals have duties, responsibilities, and part of their spiritual progression from this life to the next has to do with how they fulfill those journeys or those duties. A perfect example is the Bhagavad Gita. It's the famous religious text that has to do with Arjuna, a prince who Krishna appears to him on the battlefield, and Arjuna has been his duty. He's part of the warrior caste. And of course, Indian society divides society into multiple different castes. Well, anyway, he's part of the warrior caste, and when he looks across the battlefield, he sees family members, he sees friends, and he decides maybe I don't want to go to war. I don't really want to kill the people I know across there. And then Krishna appears to him and tells him about his dharmic duty, and that if he dies in battle or he kills somebody he loves on the other side, don't worry about it. Everybody's going to reincarnate. This is all Maya. This is a temporary illusion of pain and suffering. And if you fulfill your duty by going to war as a warrior, you're going to end up in a better place. And so this is kind of that ethos within Hinduism about the soul progressing through reincarnations back to ultimate unity. And so the cycle of reincarnation is called samsara. Some people may be familiar with that. And then the release, or what they refer to as the liberation from samsara, this eternal cycle of reincarnation, is called moksha. And so the whole point of Hinduism is to attain moksha, this sort of inner spiritual enlightenment. And through that enlightenment, you have aligned your soul with Brahman. And so they believe in things like karma, which karma isn't necessarily you do one bad thing, something bad's going to happen to you in this lifetime. That's kind of how the Westerners have interpreted the concept of karma. But karma is really about the accumulation of wrongful acts and how that outweighs the accumulation of your good acts. And that's going to dictate how you reincarnate in the next life. So you're not really getting the rewards from your karma here and now in this life, at least in the traditional Hindu sense. You're receiving those blessings in the next reincarnation, or the detriments in the next reincarnation. And then bhakti is a term to use, refer to these devotional cults, because bhakti is a term really just meaning devotion. So you have the Shivites or the Vaishnavites, who worship Vishnu. And so they perform bhakti, devotional practices, ritualistic offerings to these deities in order to, for them to sort of intercede for them, if you will, to some degree. So that's Hinduism. Do you have any questions on that before we?
No, it's good. It's a lot of good information for people who don't know stuff. And it's just giving me flashbacks because I did a comparative religion course in college, and I tried to look at my notes from back then and did not throw enough notes. And so it's bringing it back to me.
Good. Well, I'm glad that it's making some sense. I can go all over the place sometimes, so I hope that it has some type of linear logical progress here. The next one is Buddhism. So anybody who's not familiar with Buddhism, obviously it's a religion developed by the followers of the Buddha. And Siddhartha Gautama, it was a prince. The story goes that he lived in royalty. He lived in a palace, and long story short, he then witnesses suffering in the world. He witnesses aging, he witnesses sickness, and he witnesses death, things that his father, the king, were trying to protect him from. And upon realizing the suffering of existence, he again eventually leaves the palace and becomes a sort of wanderer, a nomad, and comes to the realization under a Bodhi tree that all suffering has to do with desire of temporary things. And so this gets into the Four Noble Truths, essentially that the world is transient, that the world is constantly changing. Number two, that suffering comes from desire of changing things, that the ending of suffering comes with the ending of desire. And then the fourth noble truth is you have to follow the eightfold path of Buddhism. And that's how you then relinquish or renounce the world. And so Buddhism is really a spirituality that is about totally detaching from the world itself. We'll get into how this relates to Orthodoxy because there's interesting overlaps and also major divergences between the two worldviews. But Buddhism is often referred to as an atheistic religion, and that's not the case at all. Maybe this will come back up in some of the Western misconceptions, but Buddhism is actually a wide variety of faiths. So there's three large differentiations. There's Theravada, Mahayana, and then Vajrayana. Mahayana is what's considered the greater vehicle. Theravada is considered the type of Buddhism that the Buddha was. It's called the lesser vehicle. It's a little bit more difficult to make it to nirvana. The greater vehicle, Mahayana Buddhism, that's what eventually goes around the Himalayas and then enters into Western China. And then you have China developing Pure Land and Chan Buddhism, which then Chan Buddhism goes over to Japan and you get Zen Buddhism. And so all these different variations of Buddhism have to do with the different flavors of the reception of Buddhism within various cultural and historical contexts. Vajrayana Buddhism, the Buddhism of Tibet, is actually very different. And Vajrayana Buddhism, so people, when we refer to Buddhism as atheistic, yeah, that's definitely true for Zen Buddhism. And that's probably true for many aspects of Buddhism. I mean, you get into Pure Land Chinese Buddhism, and now you have deities that meet you in a sort of intermediary period between here and nirvana. And you start thinking, okay, that kind of sounds like a deity or something. But Vajrayana has an entire pantheon of gods. And Vajrayana Buddhism is the mixture of Bon shamanism. Bon is the traditional people of Tibet before Buddhism arrived. And they perform shamanic practices. The shaman is essentially a religious figure who's really about healing. But the way that they heal is through the contacting of spirits, the contacting of animal spirits, herbs, medicines, this type of stuff, and often in getting in some type of altered state, usually through drugs, usually through psychedelics. Doesn't have to be. We have Native Americans here in America that they would do like sun dances. So they would just spin in circles in the blazing sun in the desert for 6 hours. And yeah, that'd probably make you hallucinate as well. So there's different approaches. Shamanism has different approaches, but getting into an altered state of consciousness is usually a way in which the barrier between this world and the other world is sort of mediated. It blurs the distinctions. And so getting into altered states of consciousness allows the shaman or a spiritual practitioner to contact those worlds. So Buddhism, comparing it to Hinduism, does not believe in a soul. So Buddhism believes in the anatman. They believe that the soul is an illusion because detachment, they claim, is part of the accoutrements of the ego. And so if you believe that you have a soul identity, that I'm David Patrick Harry, or that I want, more money in the world, or if I desire something, that this is all tied with a sort of misconception of the self, and that they diverge then from Hinduism, saying, look, you don't really have a soul. What you are, according to Buddhism, is you are a tumbleweed. So there's nothing in the core. There's karma that has developed around the core of this entity that's moving through space and time. And I have been reincarnated based on the accumulation of that detritus, if you will. And so the Buddhist then is trying to take the pieces of the tumbleweed apart until there's no more tumbleweed. And that then is non-existence. That means there's no longer suffering. And that means then you are one with the entire universe, creation, that type of thing. So, some of the important terms and concepts for Buddhism, it's also a karmic religion. It's also a dharmic religion, but it has an anatman. It has no soul. It believes in samsara. And the goal is to reach nirvana, in which really it's like a state of unified consciousness. And this is one of the reasons why Buddhism is so appealing to the New Age, is because salvation and their ultimate understanding of heaven, or the end of one's spiritual journey, is the relinquishment of any self-identity, in the sense that you are everything, or you are all people, or you are all awareness. And once you've really adopted that concept, then when you die, you can make it into nirvana, which is not you going to nirvana. It's like your consciousness ascending into this unified force. So that basically covers Buddhism. Buddhism is not about ritualistic practices that unite the soul to Brahman. That's what Hinduism focuses. Buddha is saying, you know what? actually the main focus is not our separation from ultimate reality. It's our illusion of desire and our ego, and that we then have to cease desire, which then leads to the lack of suffering. And by doing that, you can realize that you are a no self, and that you can then realign that self back to unified consciousness through the recognitions of the Four Noble Truths. And then once you recognize or adopt those Four Noble Truths, then you use the Eightfold Path, and you can reach that ultimate goal. So that's kind of a general overview of Buddhism.
Yeah, it's helpful, the distinction that you made, because I knew both believed in reincarnation, but I didn't know the distinction between Hindus believing that the world's the illusion and Buddhists believing that the soul is the illusion, and how that works itself out in terms of what reincarnation means.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The Hindu is ultimately trying to progress the soul through existential effort to unify with Brahman. And the Buddhist is using their existential effort to deconstruct the idea of the self and who they are and any desire that they have. Both are going to reincarnate, but as you pointed out, the cycle of reincarnation is understood differently, and the point and how and why someone reincarnates is different. And so it's a little bit different now. You know, again, Hinduism is a wide variety of different beliefs. So any one thing you say, you could probably find an example of the opposite within Hinduism. Anyways, summarize, different emphasis entirely. And the point of Buddhism is that it's ultimately impersonal. So even though we'll get into it with the apologetics with Christianity, Hinduism isn't exactly a personal God. It's an abstract, absolute concept. It's not really an engaging entity. But the goal is to unify the soul with that sort of cosmic soul. And Buddhism is really similar. It's just that they're doing away with the soul and then emphasizing consciousness.
Gotcha. Okay, so Daoism and Confucianism.
Yeah, so these will be a little bit quicker. They're not. I'm not trying to encapsulate, and you know, I taught the introduction to world religions courses at the University of Illinois, and so these things get entire weeks unto themselves. And I'm trying to just kind of hit you with the important parts. But Daoism is actually one that I found most interesting. Now, some people would argue that Taoism is more of a philosophy than a religion. And you could make the argument that aspects of Taoism are certainly more philosophical than theological, but that would attempt to nullify the multitude of historical examples, and even to this day, of Taoist temples where they literally do ritualistic religious practice in relationship to the Tao. So is it a religion? Yes, it's a religion. Is it a philosophy? Yeah, you could talk about Taoism as a philosophy, but it is certainly a religion. Now, it develops out of a teacher named Lao Tzu. Lao is just like the teacher or the great teacher. Lao Tzu, that's what that means. And basically, from what he's trying to do, and he wrote the Tao Te Ching, and he's trying to talk about a unifying metaphysical force with creation. So Taoism is ultimately dualistic, because if you look at the famous symbol that everybody's familiar with, like the yin and yang sign, it is two opposites, right? But the opposites go together. And this is where they have sort of what I would refer to as a monistic dualism. So if you talk with a Taoist, they would say, well, is it two, or is it one, or is it three? And really the answer is three. There's one circle, but there's two parts within the circle that correlate and necessitate each other. So in this sense, it is a sort of strict dualism within a monistic framework. And so the point of the Taoist is to align themselves with the underlying Tao, the flow, the metaphysical foundation of nature itself. And this has to do with a concept called Wu Wei, non-action or effortless action. And the idea is that things naturally flow in the way of the Tao. And so Taoism is a naturalistic religion. It's a naturalistic theology. It comes from Lao Tzu, observing nature itself and coming to ultimate truth claims. And from an Orthodox perspective, we'll talk about this here in the near future. I think it's in a couple questions. There's a lot of actual potential overlap for Orthodox Christianity with Taoism. Now, not at the metaphysical framework and all this different stuff, but we'll discuss this in a few, that there actually has been attempts made, and Christ the Eternal Dao by Higher Monk Damascene is one of the examples in which they try to take the Tao Te Ching and talking about the Tao and replace it with the term logos and demonstrate that at least the concept of the Tao has correlates with our understanding, our metaphysical understanding of the logos. However, the big difference is the Tao is not personal. And the logos is not just some wise teacher. The logos is the Tao, and then the Tao is a person. It's the second person of the Trinity. But Taoism is about the individual practitioner aligning themselves with the path, or the Tao. Again, it's just another translation for it. And cultivating what they would consider chi. Chi energy is the energy that flows from the cosmos and through the body. And in this way, I didn't get into all the tantric practices of Hinduism and Buddhism, but tantric Hinduism is really about, in other practices, yoga in specific is about the cultivation of a kundalini energy. So these Eastern mystical traditions outside of Confucianism believe that there's sort of a mystical energy within the human person that needs to be cultivated. Within Taoism, this is just chi. And so like Qigong or Tai Chi or the acupuncture, this all has to do with a paradigm in which the manipulation of energy is the way in which both we align with the Tao and also we heal ourselves. So generally speaking, then Taoism is a naturalistic philosophy and religion that's focused on individuals aligning themselves with a cosmic flow of harmony. I didn't use the term harmony. I should emphasize that. Taoism is all about harmony, and disharmony has to do with a failure to recognize the yin and yang. Again, these movements of opposites that flow together necessitate each other's existence. And when we talk about apologetics, this is one of the aspects of the Taoist worldview that's going to be in opposition to Christianity. But Taoism is then trying to cultivate through martial arts, through personal virtue, through education and understanding, a harmonious individual that is totally in tune with the metaphysical foundation of nature itself. So, and they do believe in Tian, which is like a type of heaven. Zhongguo, which is the Chinese term for China, it means like Middle Earth. Like they really view themselves as the center of the world. And this comes back from Taoist ideology. Now, Confucianism, a little bit easier to address Confucianism. Confucianism, could you consider that a religion? I would say you'd probably have the best argument if you're going to criticize any of these four traditions as whether it is religious or not. You could say Confucianism might be the one that is really just a philosophy. But again, even today within Confucius temples, they're lighting candles, they're praying to ancestors, they're doing ritualistic activity, which was by definition type of a religion. But Confucianism comes from a gentleman named Confucius. He lived around 550 to like 480 BC, somewhere around there. And his whole thing was about taking the concept of harmony within Taoism, which is really about the individual in relationship to the absolute. Confucianism is taking that concept of harmony and now focusing on the collective, the societal, the way that society functions, structures itself, and the goals that the individuals of the society should be striving towards. So Confucianism is really about constructing the ultimate harmonious society for the development of personal virtue. And so there's a few key concepts I wrote down regarding Confucianism. The first one is Ren, so humanness, benevolence. Li, ritual propriety, correct behavior. Xiao, filial piety. So this has to do with ancestor worship, which is still very common within China. And yet, if you ask one of these Chinese people, are you religiously Confucius? They'd be like, no, what are you talking about? I'm not religious. I'm burning candles with my ancestors here. And so they don't really cognize that as like an explicit religious devotion. But ancestor worship is a central fixture of Chinese and much of East Asian, but centrally, definitely Chinese and Japanese, and probably Korean culture. Yi, righteousness, moral disposition to do the good. Zhuangzi, the gentleman, a morally superior person. And then Tian, heaven. So they incorporate this concept of heaven within Taoism. But you can see how Confucianism is not so much about transcendent worldviews. It's really not focused on the transcendent. It's focused on the ideal harmony of society and cultivating individuals that fulfill their proper roles. This is where it kind of takes on a dharmic dimension of like Buddhism and Hinduism, although it's not the same thing. I would never characterize Confucianism as dharmic. It's not. But you see this emphasis on people appropriating their duty wherever they're at in society. They could be the king, they could be the peasant who sweeps the streets. But the worldview of Confucianism says, hey, if you sweep the streets to the absolute best ability that you have. And in so doing that, you're going to cultivate personal virtue. And that personal virtue is good for the collective of society. And the physical, pragmatic work that you do is also good for society. And so by you living up to your duty, you are helping and advancing the entire project. And so Confucianism, essentially, that is what the focus is. It's societally oriented. It's continuing the Taoist concept of harmony, but it's now looking at institutions within society, how to develop institutions. So, for example, a famous test in Chinese history was called the Gaokao. And this exam, you take the exam in Chinese culture, and it still exists today for university admissions. It goes by a different name, but essentially you take an exam, and depending on how well you score on that exam, that dictates what majors you can study in university or what opportunities you have access to. And so we're talking about even 2,000 years ago in China, people took these exams. Back then, it was built on the classics of Confucianism, and so you'd have to study Confucius's classics. And then you would take these exams, and they were very, very arduous. And they were like 3-day exams. And then based on that, the top 1% had the opportunity to work inside the imperial court, which was the ultimate goal of every Chinese person. So you see how Confucianism then developed systems to select for the people that can best fulfill meritocratically the roles within society to make society the most harmonious and efficacious that it can be.
I've kind of heard that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. I've heard that Taoism is kind of the faith or the understanding, and Confucianism is the practice.
Yeah, you can make that argument. That's why they go together, although they are separate things. They're not the same thing. But
it is common for people in China to practice both.
Yes, and even it's common for them to practice both. And then if you ask them if they're Taoist or Confucius, they'd say no to both. So it's so ingrained in the culture, it's more part of Chinese identity than part of a religious faith.
Okay. Just to kind of back up a little bit and give a little bit of historical context for these religions, how and when did they come into existence?
I wrote all those dates down. So Hinduism, there's not a specific date. I would say the earliest date we could say is the writing of the Rig Veda, which I said the Vedic period is basically between 1500 to 500 BC. So we don't know the exact date that text was written, and it is, according to at least them, it is a revealed text. So not all religions have a revealed text, meaning they believe that it was revealed. The Vedas, although they're not really read anymore. Again, now you have all these, the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, all that stuff was written much later. And the Mahabharata, all that different stuff. So I would say Hinduism, or at least the Vedic tradition, somewhere between 1500 to 1000 BC is the beginning of that. And then it's gone through so many morphings. So you have the Upanishadic period, 800 to 200 BC, the Epic and Classical period, 400 to 400 AD, and then the post-classical to medieval period. So it's gone through what we consider Hinduism today, has gone through multiple transfigurations and transformations. But in its origin, yeah, I would say somewhere. But you could say, we know for a fact people were living in the Indus Valley, so the place between Pakistan and India, since at least 2000 BC. So at least 4,000 years people have been living there. So did they have Hindu? Again, who knows? As academics, we only know, we consider the beginning of it is with the beginning of the Rig Veda, which is in a long time period. We don't know the exact date when it was written or composed. Buddhism, obviously, that's a little bit more easier to pinpoint because it begins with the life of the Buddha. And he lived from 563 to 483 BC. So again, during that axial age, for those who don't know, is an age, type it in the computer or search engine. It's the age in which a lot of the prominent figures, so Lao Tzu, Jesus, the Buddha, Confucius, I think there's another one I'm missing. They all arose in basically a 250-year period. It's called the axial age. And so Buddhism essentially develops from the 5th to 6th centuries. And before that, it didn't exist. And it is a direct response to Hinduism and the incorporation of Hindu ideas. But instead of unifying the soul, which is a piece of Brahman with Brahman, it's the realization there is no soul. And that even the attempt of Hinduism is a desire that needs to be done away with. So that would be the Buddhist critique of the Hindu spiritual practices, is they would say that the Hindu doing all these ritual devotional practices to unite their soul with ultimate reality is a desire that ultimately is going to lead to suffering, because it's until you lose that desire, you won't lose suffering. So you have to lose the desire to unite with God to actually unite, or realize that you can't unite, however you want to phrase it within Buddhism. So 5th to 6th century BC is beginning of Buddhism. Lao Tzu, 6th century BC, 5th century BC. We don't have a concrete date on when Lao Tzu, we base his life on the writing of the Tao Te Ching, which is generally understood around the 6th century BC. And then Confucianism with Confucius. Generally, his life is, like I said, is like 550 to 470 something BC. So around similar times as the Buddha.
Okay. Cool.
And it isn't until he writes his classics, and so it's really not till the Han Dynasty. So Han Dynasty is 206 BC to 220 AD, and that is when Confucianism becomes the official state ideology. And so you have basically about a 300-year period from Confucius to when Confucianism becomes the official state ideology of the Chinese Empire.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's helpful for people to kind of have that historical frame of reference of when things are happening compared to other things.
Yeah. I think having a mental timeline is ginormous, at least for me in my own edification and intellectual journey, is beginning to create like a historical timeline where somebody can say 16th century, and at least you have a handful of events that you can pull up. 16th century means 1500s. Oh, Protestant Reformation, 1517. Oh, printing press right before the 1500s. John Dee, alchemy, Rosicrucian. Usually, you need. And I think it's beneficial for everybody to have. And eventually, as you learn more, you fill in your timeline more and more and more, and then you'll have more references. But there's a common motif that I believe is true, is that if you don't know history, essentially you have amnesia. Because if you don't know history, and that's why I think it's really beneficial for all young men to kind of become history nerds, is if you learn history, when you look at the contemporary period, you can make so many more connections than if you don't. And if you don't know history and you're looking at the contemporary period, you're like an amnesia patient that wakes up and the world's happening and you can't really figure out why it's the way it is.
I don't have anything to add. I agree. I think generally when we're talking about religions and trying to like get a better understanding of what they have to say about the world and how they frame things, they typically frame it in there's a problem with humanity, and then they present some kind of solution, which is salvation and an ultimate goal. So how do these Far Eastern religions approach that question and framework?
The ultimate problem or the soteriological question of Hinduism has to do with addressing, again, this is all rooted within their own presuppositions, but it's having to address the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, essentially karma, and then the ignorance of one's true nature. So in Hinduism, again, they believe in a soul. So it's the misunderstanding of oneself as a separate ego rather than a instantiation of Brahman, right? So the soul is a piece of Brahman. Brahman has a avatar within space and time, but really it's an abstract, absolute concept of deity or divinity. And this, again, this varies depending on schools of Hinduism. But they're trying to address the problem of samsara and what they believe is the misunderstanding of the individual as their ego being separate from what they would consider God. And therefore, they try to achieve the answer is moksha, liberation from samsara, through typically forms of yoga. And yoga, it does not mean, the downward dog in a hot, sweaty yoga studio. Yoga is a term, it's a Sanskrit term that means yoking. Because what did we say Hinduism is trying to do? Unite the soul back to this absolute concept of divinity. So these forms of yoga, which are not all like hatha yoga is a form of like what we would consider like the sort of fitness yoga or people doing all these postures. That's one form of yoga. That's one school of yoga. You have jnana yoga, for example, which is about knowledge. This would be essentially philosophy, the idea that you can unify your soul with God through knowledge. Right. So Hinduism has multiple different kinds of yogas in which you can yoke your soul back to Brahma. Jnana yoga, the path through knowledge, is one. The path of devotion, bhakti yoga, karma yoga, meaning a focus on righteous action and sort of non-attachment to the world. It has that. It's not the same focus as Buddhism, but certainly has aspects of that. Or Raja Yoga, which is meditation and personal discipline. These are different yogas. These are different methods that you can use to yoke your soul back to God. And so that's really what it's trying to address is union with Brahman, the realization of one soul, and then the liberation of the individual and merging with the absolute. Buddhism, what they're trying to address is suffering. So like I said, with the story of Siddhartha Gautama, he recognizes that there's all this suffering in the world. And his question is, how do we deal with suffering and how do we get away from it? And so he, as we said, has to do with desire of transient things. This is the root of all suffering. And so they want to extinguish desire and attachment to anything that is in the world. And this is what it came back to the story with the American woman who didn't realize that she was going to have to give up full attachment to her family and children. You can't hold on to that and enter nirvana. Come on now. So their solution is, like I said, the Eightfold Path, releasing attachment, doing these things to sort of disattach oneself, renounce the world. And they do that. And in addition to doing that, they do focus on ethical conduct, mental discipline, and the cultivation of wisdom. So these are methods to attain to that realization that you're nobody and that really you need to get rid of all these attachments to the world. And then you can enter nirvana and essentially live in a sort of unified, perfected state of consciousness. Daoism has to do with alienation from the Tao, the way, the flow of things. And so it is trying to address the disconnection from the natural flow of life that results in weakness, suffering, and imbalances in the individual. Typically, Taoism is usually very much focused on the spirituality of the individual, where Confucianism comes in to address the society as a whole. And so the solution for the Taoists, return to the Tao, Wu Wei, non-action, effortless action. This is what Tai Chi martial arts, this is where Kung Fu, even though it comes out of the Shaolin Temple, which is Buddhist, it was incorporating these Wu Wei concepts that were deeply penetrated Chinese culture and how do you move with force and manipulate it? Again, going with the flow, going with the Tao. And so it emphasizes simplicity, humility, harmony, and flexibility. And it's these things that Taoism is trying to offer the individual to make it to Tien, heaven. Confucianism, what it's trying to do is address the social and moral disorder of society and the breakdown of relationships and traditions. Confucianism, and this is why I would say partly why China has been so prominent throughout history, even though, again, a lot of different periods. I don't know how familiar the listeners are with Chinese history, but a lot of different dynastic periods. But this idea of tradition, the importance of tradition, and creating a society that reinforces tradition is a key Confucius concept of how they perpetuate this ideal order into the future. And so, as we already kind of hinted on with modernity, being in the West, we are in a modernist or postmodernist product, depending on where you align on that conversation. And we are trying to radically erode tradition. And China is trying to get back to it. And I think those are really important distinctions between the sort of psyches of the West and the East. So Confucianism is about the cultivation of virtue, the cultivation of personal virtue, the cultivation of virtue through adopting your role and duty within society and doing that to the best of your ability. It places a preeminence on education, as we talked about with the Gaokao, is that China wants an educated populace, at least educated in the limits of that it finds ideal for societal functioning. And its goal is to create Junzi. Junzi is like the ideal gentleman. And so Confucianism is trying to create the ideal individual, which is really part of a sort of Taoist concept, and how that relates to the society as a whole. So it's focused on harmonious society, personal moral perfection, leading to societal flourishing, and alignment with the moral mandate of heaven, essentially.
So this might be a little bit of an oversimplification, but it seems like Hinduism and Daoism, or Hinduism and Buddhism, are basically trying to say your intuition and your perception about everything is wrong, and you just need to get it right, and then everything will fall into place. And then Taoism and Confucianism are more about aligning and, like you said, kind of making harmony and
Yes.
making things congruent and orderly.
Yeah. I'd say that's pretty fair.
So as an Orthodox Christian, where do you see flaws in how these religions approach these questions of soteriology, the self, purpose, that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm. So where I think Hinduism gets things right that we could agree with is it recognizes the brokenness of the world that we exist in, right? Samsara, this cycle. Now, we don't believe in the cycle of death and rebirth, but at least they're recognizing that the world as we're experiencing it is broken in some way. It's not the way that it fully is intended to be. And therefore, they seek liberation from this broken system through moksha, through liberation from samsara. And it understands that we do have a human soul, and the human soul has a responsibility in regards to a profound spiritual reality. So in regards to those points, I would say, okay, we as Orthodox Christians can totally agree with that. Where we would say they err, I wrote down a few here. The first one is monism. So claiming the individual soul, the Atman, is identical to Brahman, erases the distinction between creator and creation, a fatal theological error, at least for us Orthodox Christians. And this is where you can get gurus who say that they now are Shiva, or they now are God. That distinction between creator and created, contingent and non-contingent entities, it doesn't have the same focus. So I would say the Advaita Vedanta sort of monistic school of Hinduism fails to maintain a metaphysical distinction that is necessary for a true recognition of how the world works. So the failure to have created versus created, salvation by self-effort. So one of the things I highlight is that moksha is achieved through human effort. And we talked about the various yogas, be it knowledge, devotion, physical postures and breathing, development of kundalini. And so it's not through grace. It's not that you are aligning with a graceful will and loving desire of a transcendent entity, God. It's through your own personal existential effort of doing these things. And it's more like you can check off these boxes as you move and ascend this ladder. In Orthodox, we just don't understand salvation to be that systematic. right? So we believe that you can lose your salvation, which is different from obviously Protestantism. But I would say that this salvation by effort is a sort of paradigmatic difference between us and them. Another one is impersonal absolute. This is an obvious one, and this is going to be true for all of the four traditions that we mentioned. Is Brahman is seen as impersonal. So the piece of your soul, which is identical with ultimate reality, your Atman and Brahman, this is an impersonal, abstract force, whereas Orthodox Christianity is a personal God, three persons, one essence, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Brahman is not a personal deity that you commune with in that way. And that impersonal dimension of God is going to be a major differentiation to why, one, we don't worship the same God, and why this is a totally different spiritual paradigm. And of course, the last one, obvious one, is reincarnation. We don't believe in reincarnation, although I've seen this growing in Catholicism. I read a book that was looking at American Catholics, and it showed like 40-some%, mostly coming from the Hispanic world, that they believe in reincarnation within a Catholic framework. And so this is not something that's Christian, because we believe that God fully sanctified the human, not just human nature, but the human body, and that the human body is a blessing and a gift, and that the second person of the Trinity is actually ascended into eternity right now with human form. So the idea of the resurrection is very, very important for us, where with their doctrine of death and rebirth and samsara through reincarnation, you really can't find a place for the emphasis of the resurrection to fit and really take hold in the same way, because we believe we have one life. They believe they have unlimited based on how many reincarnations they have. And so the idea of a savior that died so that you can live forever, it doesn't resonate in the same degree. So that would be my thing for Hinduism. For Buddhism, what does Buddhism get right? Well, we would say that it accurately identifies that there's a pervasive nature of suffering within human existence. So we as Orthodox Christians, now we believe that suffering is like going to the gym. It strengthens you spiritually. And this is what we mean by carrying your cross and following Christ, is that Christ was burdened with the ultimate tragedy and the ultimate suffering, and that we then, as followers of him, embrace the suffering of the world as something that actually purifies and strengthens us and brings us closer to God. So suffering is not something to be avoided. I'm saying that Buddhism correctly identifies the nature of suffering that Orthodox Christianity also identifies. The way they approach suffering then are totally opposite. It emphasizes detachment from worldly illusions. I think that there could be an overlap there with orthodoxy. Being overly attached to ideologies, man-made creations, personal brands, consumerism. These things are illusions. These things are, they bring you down spiritually. These are forces of essentially self-worship, when orthodoxy is explicitly anti-self-worship. So I would say they emphasize detachment. Again, they go to extreme here, and I'm going to highlight that. It's extreme detachment. We don't abide by that, but at least they recognize that this isn't a hedonistic spirituality. This isn't a hedonistic religion, which you just dive into material sensation and pleasure deeper and deeper. And then it seeks freedom from suffering, which is ultimately what we find in Jesus Christ and the Orthodox Church. But that, of course, that happens after this life. And even for the Buddhists, that is also true. They don't not experience suffering in this life. Now, some would say they reached Bodhihood or Buddhahood and became a bodhisattva. But I don't know. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that you can be human and not suffer. They may make different claims, but I'm not convinced. Anyways, errors regarding Buddhism is the denial of the self. The first and foremost is that they reject the existence of a soul. And in that pursuit, they abolish personhood. So Buddhism teaches that there is no eternal soul. Orthodoxy affirms that each human person has a unique, unrepeatable hypostasis, and an eternal existence meant for communion with God. And this is where we believe sin, as Orthodox Christians, is slowly but surely dissolving and destroying your personhood. And so the ways that we become more like Christ is through virtue, piety, obedience, through the sacraments of the church. And so there is an effort to become more like Christ in fulfilling who our unique, personal, unrepeatable identity is. They're trying to annihilate, they're trying to do away with the concept of personhood. And this has really become prominent within New Age spirituality because people take, psychedelic drugs. Maybe they go to an ayahuasca ceremony in somewhere for a couple days, some type of retreat, many of them here on the West Coast in the United States. And they come to the realization that, oh my gosh, my awareness is the awareness of every person on the planet, that, my existence as Jane Doe is totally an illusion. It's not real at all. We would say this is actually one of the ultimate forms of prelest. And prelest is a Russian term describing spiritual delusion. Orthodoxy believes that spiritual warfare is occurring in your imagination. First and foremost, this is the battlefield. And everybody has experienced these weird mental images or thoughts. Maybe you got a brand new phone and you're driving down the road and you have this weird desire to hold your new phone out the window, or you're on the top of a building and all of a sudden you get this thought like, I should jump. We believe that these are actually spiritual, and maybe not the phone so much, but you get my point here. We believe that these are spiritual assaults. They're called logismi. And that these mental images, and we can also get beautiful mental images. We would say maybe these logismi are coming from the angels, but these demonic assaultive thoughts that sometimes come out of nowhere, something that you had never thought or you had never believed, that this is the spiritual battlefield. And whether we accept or condone these mental images really dictates our journey spiritually. And so Buddhism, in its rejection of the soul, correlates for us Orthodox Christians as the role that sin is ultimately destroying our personhood and making us less and less like God. And so if you destroy the person or you become enamored, and this is where I brought up the imagination, if you believe these concepts, like you go to the ayahuasca ceremony, now you believe that you really have no identity, this will lead to a cascading effect of destruction, probably with your relationships, things going on in your life. And that this is a part of a spiritual warfare to get you to divorce your identity from Christ, who's already sanctified and perfected human nature and human embodiment. So that was a long riff on the first one, which is the absence of the concept of soul. Again, same thing with Hinduism, salvation without grace. So nirvana is attained through personal effort, so your sort of existential pursuit. Cessation over communion. I thought this was an interesting one, is that if you think about it, Buddhism is really about the cessation, the renunciation of the world, and it seeks an end to personal existence as the ultimate aim. And so this is very different from an Orthodox Christian who's called towards communion. Communion, first and foremost with God, but also communion with your relationship. This is where, from an Orthodox Christian perspective of the American woman that went to the Buddhist monastery and had to renounce her children, we find that is horrendous. Again, back to the example of once you adopt these ideas, it actually leads to like more destruction in your life. She adopted these ideas. She wanted to become a monastic. She shaves her head and she's told she can't contact her children ever again. And as an Orthodox Christian, we say that's terrible. You as a woman who gave life to children are a mother, and that calling is higher than renouncing the world. In fact, we would say that's an abject of responsibility and duty. That's not something to be idolized. That's something to be demonized. That's you failing to be the person that through God's providence and through your own life circumstances and choices, you have children, you have responsibilities that you are called to be there for them. And so the extremities of their detachment theology, orthodoxy, we could agree with detaching from mundane things in the world, or even things like personal prestige, fame, wealth, these types of things, detach from those. But to detach from relationships where we have communion, both with God, but with each other, is an absolute no-no. And so we believe that communion and relationships are essential. And this is why we as Orthodox Christians believe that we're saved as a collective. We're not saved as individuals. We're saved as the body of Christ within the Orthodox Church. And so this collective communal emphasis is a major, major differentiation between Orthodoxy and Buddhism. And the last one is, no resurrection. So Buddhism, they're not trying to take their body with them. In fact, the body, because it defecates and urinates and demands nutrition and water, this is a part of the suffering of the world, right? So this is part of the tumbleweed you got to get rid of. They don't believe in resurrection. They do have relics. So within certain Buddhist traditions, if somebody's believed to be a bodhisattva or enlightened, when they cremate them, which is the customary burial practices of Buddhism, which again is Orthodox Christians, because of the resurrection, this last point I'm making, we do not cremate. God already took a human body. This is a vehicle for salvation. We're going to have a spiritual body, a perfected body, but a body nonetheless. The Buddhists are trying to totally annihilate the body. They don't want it to come with us because it's a symbol of the suffering and the desires of the world. So I was going to say they have relics. So when people are enlightened they'll cremate them. And sometimes they claim, I'm skeptical, but they claim that there's crystals, diamonds that are formed. And this is reflective of them giving a symbol of the diamond path, the perfected path of bodhisattvahood. But they certainly aren't taking their body with them. They're going to be cremated after they die. What does Taoism get right? It recognizes the disruption between humanity and the fundamental order of reality, of harmony. And it values, I would say, it values humility, simplicity, and naturalness for sure. And so the Tao, as I said earlier, it's impersonal. So one of the big apologetic differentiations is that their Tao is like an impersonal ultimate principle of reality. And it's not a personal God who is that reality itself. So the Tao is one, not a person. It's not a personality. It's not something you can interact with. And it is, let's just say, it is the metaphysical foundation of the world. We're saying as Orthodox Christians, the Logos is the metaphysical foundation of the world. And the Logos pre-exists the world itself. It was already the second person of the Holy Trinity, the Word. And it is a person. And it can be communed with. And it took on human form. So where Orthodoxy takes Taoism, or at least a fundamental concept of Taoism, and then goes way further, is it's saying, okay, we'll accept, and this is the point of Christ the Eternal Dao, we'll accept the Tao as a metaphysical concept of harmony and the balancing of harmony. But then we'll take it to a further degree and say that metaphysics is just the attribute of the second person who is the expression and is a personal deity that you can commune with. Regarding the Tao as an impersonal concept of divinity, we were talking about the yin and yang, and I wanted to highlight from an apologetic standpoint as a Christian is we do not believe that darkness and light are yin and yang correlates of each other that necessitate each other's existence. And I would argue that this point that I'm going to highlight now is the biggest differentiation between the Orthodox paradigm and really all other worldviews. And it has to do with this idea that God's uncreated energies, so these energies that are natural to the essence of God, one essence, three persons, we as Orthodox say we can't make any claims about the essence of God because the essence of God is so beyond us and so transcendent that we can't make a positive or a cataphatic claim about it. But what we can make a cataphatic claim about are the energies that are natural to the persons of God. And so the idea is that you and me, we just met, right? Online. I don't know the essence of you. You don't know the essence of me. But we come to know each other as two persons through our energies, the way we talk, the way we act, the things we do, the things we create. And so Orthodoxy believes the same thing is true with God. And so energies, we believe these energies are uncreated, meaning they pre-exist creation. These aren't created. Logic, reason, truth, love, mercy, compassion, honor, glory, grace, light. These are energetic realities of God, and they only have a positive existence. So the opposite of truth is false, right? Or falsehood. Well, falsehood does not have a positive ontological existence within Orthodoxy as it does within Taoism. In Taoism, they necessitate each other's existence. Without falsehood, without evil, there would be no good. Well, Orthodoxy, we say, no. That is a misconcept, because if we incorporated that within Christianity, we would say then that God created evil. But that would violate the definition of God as omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipresent, all these different things, omnipotent. So God can't create evil, or he himself then would have evil within himself. So Orthodoxy says everything that's the opposite of these energies. So let's say death and life. Life is an uncreated energy. The opposite is death. But death is the absence of God. Death is the absence of God's energy. So if you're filled with God's energies, which is the point of theosis, this ladder of divine ascent within Orthodoxy of how we become deified, if you're filled with God's energies, which are uncreated, how can you die when you physically die? You can't, right? So the idea is that you only actually die, meaning you have non-existence, is if you voluntarily and willfully reject this personal relationship, the grace of God, and engaging with these uncreated energies. And so we're all then choosing our salvation, but our paradigm, our metaphysical paradigm, is not built on these dialectics between opposites. We would say only the positive attributes of God, these uncreated energies, exist. And then we have terms to describe the opposites of those. And this is even consistent with thermodynamics and how we understand the concept of cold. Cold doesn't exist. Cold is a term we use, totally relative term we've used to describe the absence of thermodynamic energy. So heat energy, that's the only thing that exists on a spectrum. And we would say this is really hot, this is really cold. The only thing that's happening is the amount of heat energy, thermodynamic energy. And when thermodynamic energy is no longer present, we say now it's really, really cold. We would say this is exactly how we understand our theological paradigm, and that the opposites of these energies, they are not ontologically existent. They are just relative terms we use to describe the absence of where God is and what God does. So I wanted to make that point, and that then relates to my second point, which is the relativization of good and evil within Taoism. Is with what I just said, within Orthodoxy, we do not believe evil was created by God, or that evil is a necessity for the existence of God or the existence of the good. Daoism would make that claim. And so from that perspective, I would argue that Daoism then relativizes good and evil because it blurs the distinction between the two. And it affirms that somehow they necessitate each other's. And from that perspective, you can hear these weird, sort of Eastern mystical theories of that. Is evil really bad then? If evil necessitates the good, is evil really bad? Evil is actually good, right? And it's like, well, they're getting into all these concepts because they're playing off dialectic. So I would say that would be my second criticism of Taoism. And then the third one, consistent with the two before, is that there's no historical redemption because there is the Tao, if we're going to use that term, doesn't incarnate as a person within Taoism. And so there is no historical redemption. It lacks the historical intervention of God within space and time that Christianity offers. So I would say those are probably my main points. And then to finish out Confucianism, I'll do these real quick. It recognizes virtue, societal order, correct relationships, honoring one's parents, moral cultivation, all things that Orthodoxy would agree with there. However, like the ones before, I'm kind of reiterating here, it has moralism without grace. So Confucianism sees salvation as self-attained by virtue through education and ritual, communal ritual. And Orthodoxy teaches that human virtue must actually be healed, that we believe that we are fallen entities. And so it's through the sacraments and through the personal relationship we form with Christ, and then trying to become like that, we are actually healed. This is why the Orthodox Church refers to itself as a hospital for the sick, and Christ is the great physician of souls. And so we teach that every person has to be transfigured, and they do that. And that is a lifetime struggle. That is not some mystical new age point in which you took 5 hits of acid and now you are transfigured when you come back down. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a life of struggle that transfigures you as a person into a closer image to Christ. Another one is no personal union with God. Again, similar as the traditions before. And then their concept of heaven is very abstract because Confucianism is really building upon Taoism. Confucianism doesn't actually give a detailed articulation of what heaven is per se. It's sometimes personalized, but often remains a sort of impersonal moral force, which is very different from a Christian understanding of the triune God and a eternal dwelling place for those who choose to live in communion with Him. So those would probably be my big apologetic criticisms of Confucianism.
Gotcha. The reason I wanted to discuss this is because there is, a certain clique or niche within America that, people are drawn to these religions for one reason or another. Would you be able to describe some maybe popular misconceptions about these Far Eastern religions that most people might have here in America or the West more broadly?
Regards to misconceptions, I would say probably the number one misconception regarding Hinduism is that that term refers to a unified body of religious practices and beliefs. And so it is not. It is extremely diverse, and it's really a term, as we've already articulated, so I don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but it's just a term used to describe the wide variety of devotional practices present within the subcontinent of India. And so you can find everything within it and many, many, many different practices that contradict each other. And one school says this, the other school says the exact opposite. And yet when you study it as a religious study, you're saying this is all Hinduism. And in Christianity, we have a more difficult concept of believing that. I mean, we get into polemical arguments between Catholics and Orthodox over subtleties of doctrine. And Hinduism, it's much, much different in the differentiations between groups. So Hinduism, number one misconception is that it's some unified system and everybody believes or is practicing the same thing. The other I would say is that Hinduism is some peaceful, tolerant, unified faith system. And I've seen this in some of the New Agers that talk about Hinduism and describe it as like harmonious and beautiful and gives a voice to all people. And it's like this benevolent faith. And it's like, what? Have you studied any of the history? Like, this isn't true at all. It's it has, yes, it has aspects of nonviolence, but it also has the exact cults of the exact opposite. Anybody who studied the relationship between Hindus and Muslims would understand, at least have some understanding of the conflict between Pakistan and India, which right now have nuclear weapons aimed at each other and are considered like on the brink of nuclear warfare to this day. So, no, it's not some, live and let live spirituality. And even within doctrines like reincarnation, so to demonstrate the diversity of what we would consider Hinduism, I would consider reincarnation one of the most central elements of Hinduism. And yet even that doctrine can be contradicted because there are schools that actually reject the idea of reincarnation, and yet they still have their own devotional cult, and they have restructured Hindu worldview and paradigm into a new structure. But even like fundamental things like that can be contradicted. Yeah, I would say that would probably be the best. The best is that one, it's not unified. Two, it's not some system of pure love and benevolence. And to not say there aren't nice and great, wonderful Indian people. Obviously, we're talking about the general misconceptions here. There's a wide variety, and not all of it is peace and harmony. For Buddhism, I would say the most common misconception regarding Buddhism is that I would say the number one is people claim that it's atheistic. And that might be true in certain contexts, but it's a failure to recognize, again, the diversity of Buddhism as a category of faith. So that has led people to say that, Buddhism's more like a philosophy for life. It's not really a religion. It's like, what? No, not at all. Go to a monastery in East Asia. They will tell you this is not a philosophy. And so they have prayers, they have offerings, they have monasticism, they have veneration of Buddhas and bodhisattvas and their own devotional cults. So it's not a philosophy. It's definitely a religion. And even though people say that Buddhism is all about mindfulness, this is a failure of Western people to recognize that mindfulness is just a step on the extinguishing of personhood. So, yeah, I'd ask you to be more mindful, sit in meditation and make sure you can hear the birds and that your awareness expands and you hear more and more distant sounds and you become more in tune with your environment. But the ultimate goal is for you to realize that you're nobody, to renounce your family. If you have children, like there's a famous story of a woman from America who was Buddhist, claimed to be, she was a Western white woman, converted to Buddhism. And then she was like in her late 40s, and she felt like she was called to become a Buddhist monastic. And so she moved, I think it was to Nepal. And when she got there, they told her, look, you have to renounce your children. And she goes, oh, well, I still like to check in with them. Like, no, you have to take on a new name, and you have to no longer contact anybody that you knew previously because you're now a new person. And that was like a huge struggle for her. But this is the point, and this will come back when we get in the apologetics, is that personhood is an illusion within, the soul is an illusion within Buddhism. And so the whole point is really what, as Orthodox Christians would argue, is the ultimate goal of the devil, which is the annihilation of the personhood, which is made in the image of God. But I would say that's probably the biggest one. In Buddhism, they like I said, they're atheists. They don't worship gods. No, they absolutely do. Vajrayana Buddhism literally is explicit. They have hundreds of different deities that they worship, and gods that have different powers and do different things. So it's definitely a religion. It's not atheistic. It can be, depending on the school. And it's not just about mindfulness and becoming more self-conscious and conscious. It's about, that's a process, that's a step in the process of annihilating the concept of the self and personhood. So I'd probably say those are the three biggest misconceptions regarding Buddhism. And then Taoism, you could say one misconception is the same thing, arguing it's a philosophy and not a religion, although you probably have a little bit of a stronger foot to stand on, but it still would fail to recognize all the religious aspects and devotional rituals. But I would say a big one is people confuse Taoism as like some hippie chill religion. Like you just chill and you just get with the flow and, live and let live. Everything going to fall into the right place. And it's like, no, Taoism is involves rigorous discipline, breathing practices, alchemy. So Taoist alchemy, the elixir of life, was one of the things that they were on the search for. Rituals, complex cosmology. This is not a mere passive relaxation. It's the recognition. And in fact, Taoists would say this is one of the reasons why you shouldn't be dirty, right? So to be in line with the Tao also means a sort of purification and cleanliness. That means you actually actively have to do something, right? In Christianity, we say cleanliness is godliness, because if you just leave something alone, from our concept in a fallen world, it becomes filthy. You have to actively engage it to keep it clean. And Taoism takes a similar approach, even though the whole thing is about aligning with the flow of nature. And so I would say that it's not some hippie chill religion. It's actually very much a religious and rigorous discipline to become an actual practicing Taoist. And as I said earlier, too, is that it's not non-dualistic. I've heard this one multiple times, as people will say, well, Tao is, it's a non-dual religion. Or this Eastern Eastern mysticism focuses on like non-dualism. Well, it's a monistic dualism. I mean, it is explicit that darkness and light are opposites of the same thing, of the Tao, right? So the Tao is the circle, the yin and yang are the opposites composed within. The Tao encompasses both. And so it's explicitly a dualistic, a monistic dualistic paradigm. It's not non-dualistic in that it focuses on dynamic balances of opposites because they necessitate each other's existence. I guess you could say something about people associate Taoism as like some type of ecological spirituality. They especially in the West, they associate that with some type of preservation of nature equals the preservation of the Tao. And so while Taoism appreciates nature, there's no doubt about that, alchemy is a central feature of Taoism, which is all about the magical manipulation of nature. And so I wouldn't say that's some like Western spirituality of nature. It's more of nature's incorporated, much in a pagan worldview, within a paradigm of magical influence and magical theurgy. Theurgy is a religious term to describe the idea that you can perform a ritual and command spiritual forces to act, right? So if you perform a ritual devoted towards Venus on the day of Venus, wearing the colors of Venus, speaking or singing a song, a hymn to Venus, like you have to line up all these things that symbolically match. They're called correspondences. And so every time you have an item and then you create the correspondence that it attaches to, so that you can create basically a ladder or some type of conduit from heavenly powers or the stars or astrology, and that you can funnel that energy down into earthly practices and command things to work. And this is really the focus on ritualistic magic. So those would probably be my things on Taoism. It is a religion. It's not some hippie do relax. It's actually very rigorous. It's not non-dualistic, and it's not some veneration, just pure like Western veneration of climate change, nature, or something like that. And then Confucianism, people would say it's mostly just a moral philosophy. And you can certainly see why people would say that about Confucianism, but Confucianism is more than just a moral philosophy, although that is a central core of what it is. It still has ritualistic sacrifice to ancestors, concepts of heaven, a spiritual understanding of cosmic order. So it's more than just a philosophy. So I guess the three critiques of Buddhism, Daoism, and Confucianism, those misconceptions could go together. The idea that Confucianism, I've heard people try to adopt Confucianism and the rhetoric of like Western democracy and like libertarian freedom. And it's like, what? Confucianism is not about democracy. In fact, it's like explicitly imperial. Like it's focused on that they believe in an emperor that is mandated by God or heaven, which they would say it's a mandate of heaven for them to rule. So I don't understand. It's incredibly hierarchical because that's how they understand order. They believe the cosmos is hierarchical, and we do too. And therefore, if the cosmos is hierarchical and you're going to create societies that reflect cosmic order and harmony, then you have to create incredibly rigorous hierarchical authoritative structures within society. That is totally the opposite of any of these Western progressives that want to use Confucianism as some type of ideology that conforms with their ideas on, Marxist economics or something like that. Confucianism sees all humans as inherently equal. I would say this is actually a misconception. It has a value for all humans, no doubt about that, but it emphasizes roles and duties. So some of the important relationships within Confucianism is like father and son, ruler and subject. You see, these are dialectics, and they're describing relationships that are consistent throughout time. Right? There's always going to be fathers and sons and rulers and subjects, but it's describing authoritative hierarchies and then how they engage with each other. Right? So like friend to friend is one of them. And so the idea of the Confucian is to accept where you are in that hierarchy of authority and then fulfill your role and your duty. And so this is very different from a Christian concept that we're all made in God's image and have equal worth. Confucians say that everybody has worth, but that worth certainly varies based on the person. The emperor of China is worth a lot more than the person sweeping the streets. And they don't have a concept of being made in the image of God and being equal. They would say they're all useful. They all have worth. But that worth of the street sweeper and the worth of the emperor is very, very different. They are not the same person. So I would say that would probably be my main misconceptions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism.
Gotcha. Okay, so what would you say that these religions have to say about Jesus? I know that maybe they don't specifically articulate like a dogmatic claim necessarily, but it seems like all of the world religions in one way or another react to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So how would they react to Jesus?
Well, differently between each. I would say Hinduism has basically already incorporated Jesus into, in a sense, their pantheon. So the Apostle Thomas developed the church there in India after the death of Christ. And Christianity's been in India ever since then. So Hinduism, as a collection of practices, has been exposed to Christianity for a very long time. And essentially, they've already incorporated him as another avatar or as a great moral teacher or a guru figure. And so some traditions have actually placed him in the divine pantheon next to, Vishnu and Shiva and Krishna, Rama, Buddha, these types. So like, for example, Hinduism, it's so encompassing that even when Buddha tried to break away from it and found Buddhism, Hindus just adopted Buddha as another avatar and just kept it like, so then they just like brought people back into Hinduism. Like, oh, okay, you're a bit, well, he's an avatar. So why don't you just have a devotional cult to him? So I would say that Hinduism is basically, they don't reject Jesus. They recontextualize him into something very different than what Christians would understand him, but it's very appealing to New Age. Because the New Age, they would just say, well, look, Jesus is another avatar. He's another spiritual teacher. You know, look at the axial age. All these great spiritual teachers arising around the same time. This is really the movement of divine consciousness or cosmic consciousness, or then what the New Age has redefined as Christ consciousness, which is essentially the same thing. So Hinduism basically identifies him as some type of enlightened master, but certainly not incarnated God, because an avatar is not the same thing as the incarnation. And so Hinduism absorbs Christ into its pantheon, but refuses to confess him as the Lord and Savior of all creation. So that's kind of Hinduism. Buddhism, historically, it's not very mentioned. So it's not like Buddhism has a commentary on Jesus. Hinduism, they have some type of devotional cults that have sort of incorporated that. But modern Buddhists would probably say that Jesus is a type of bodhisattva. So a bodhisattva is somebody who attained Buddhahood. And Buddha is a person who articulated the paths to Buddhahood. And that's why he's the great Buddha. But Buddha isn't unique in what can be attained, because that's an opportunity for all people if they become detached. So Buddhism kind of talks about, I'm talking about modern Buddhists, so not Buddhism as a tradition speaking about Jesus, but modern Buddhists kind of see him as a bodhisattva, a compassionate moral teacher, someone who attained like a high level of spiritual realization, of spiritual illumination. But it denies him as the existence of a personal God, obviously, as we already described in their paradigm. He's just a teacher. If he doesn't have the status of God, you can kind of recontextualize Jesus however you will. And so Buddhism essentially just labels him as a good moral teacher. They don't confess him as God or God incarnate, but they respect his ethics. I would say Buddhism probably appeals to Jesus's ethics more than anything. So I would say they probably see him as a great ethical teacher. Taoism as a tradition does not speak about Jesus. Christianity doesn't enter China until the 6th century. That was under the Tang Dynasty. It's actually a pretty interesting story. There's actually a great book called The Jesus Sutras. For anybody who's never read this, it's actually a pretty interesting read. It's by Martin Palmer, who's actually I believe he's Anglican. This book documents that in the 90s, he actually discovered the Daqing Pagoda. And so the ancient capital of China is Xi'an. And in Xi'an, during the Tang Dynasty, this was the imperial capital. And when the Church of the East, which for those listening, not the Orthodox Church, it's a Nestorian variation that got essentially annihilated during the rise of Islam. At one point, the entire Middle East, basically from Greece all the way to China, was on the brink of becoming Christian. But Islam kind of destroyed that. But anyway, during that period, in the 6th century and in the 7th century, due to the trade on the Silk Road, Christianity, the Church of the East, enters into China. And the Tang Emperor actually really likes Christianity. One, because it doesn't really ask much of the state. Two, they were willing to die for the emperor as long as they were able to be there and practice their religion. They would die for the emperor in regards to sort of Mongolian invasions of the north. So they would defend anybody coming in from there. And it didn't practice slavery. So interestingly enough, during this period, the Taoists and the Christians were not very much in favor of slavery, whereas the Buddhists were using slave labor to build all their Buddhist temples in China. Anyways, the Daqing has to do with Christianity being called the religion of light in Chinese. So when you talk about the term for Christianity in Chinese is the religion of light. And so they thought it was a very moral and beautiful religion. Eventually, it gets annihilated a couple hundred years later. And anyways, Buddhism takes over China. But Taoism, getting back to Taoism, it's sees Christ as someone who lived in perfect harmony with the Tao. And again, this would be like a modern, I'm putting myself in the shoes of a modern Taoist and how they would interpret him. He'd be a kind of sage or spiritual teacher. They would not recognize the Tao as the same thing as what we articulate as the Logos. Perennialists online try to make this claim all the time. They'll say, well, the Tao and the Logos is the exact same thing. No, it's not. Like, these are fundamentally different when we start talking about the nature of God and how it relates to these things. So the Tao, impersonal, undefined, whereas Christ is the eternal Logos, personally incarnate. And we would say that Jesus didn't just merely live in harmony with the cosmic forces of creation. That's kind of what the Taoists would say. He was the one through whom all things were made. Again, a little reference to John 1:3, that he is the Tao. And the Tao is really just a small section of who he is. And so we would say that Taoism maybe admires aspects of Christ, specifically his humility and his natural wisdom. Those are very appealing virtues within Taoism. But it failed to see him, again, as the eternal Son and Savior of humanity. Same thing that's been true with the three traditions we've already mentioned. Then Confucianism, where Confucianism gets things right, it sees Jesus as the ideal gentleman, essentially. So the Junzi is a term for the ideal gentleman. I'd say Confucianism sees Jesus as the Confucian embodiment of the virtues and ideals that they aspire towards. And modern Confucians, I've heard some people equate, again, same thing as before, as Jesus as sort of a great teacher of ethics, or virtue. But Christ did not merely be a perfect example of morality. He's more than that. He is the God-man who redeems us from sin and death. So, like the other ones, they just don't go far enough. Confucianism's focus on social harmony and ethics kind of misses the need for spiritual rebirth and forgiveness and union with God. And he's not just a moral figure. He's the divine physician of souls. He's the bridegroom of the soul. He is the judge of the soul. And so it reduces Jesus again to just basically a moral teacher. Typically Confucianism isn't very supernatural, so they would probably ignore all the supernatural dimensions of Christ's life, and they would certainly deny the need for a personal savior.
So it seems like they all kind of diminish and appropriate Jesus as needed in order to make it work in their system.
Yeah.
But they don't like the Jesus is God stuff.
Right. Yep.
Okay, so you kind of mentioned this earlier, but I just wanted to bring it back to kind of open a little bit of discussion since I think it would be relevant. Have you read Christ and the Eternal Dao by Heider Monk Damascene? And if so, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I've read that book. I've done a stream covering that book. I think it's really useful, and that book has been a great bridge for me. So for me, doing Orthodox apologetics online, a lot of the people that I engage with as non-believers are coming from spiritual but not religious, New Age, the occult, or some of these Eastern mystical traditions. Those are typically that's kind of my corner of Orthodox apologetics. And so Christ the Eternal Dao has been a great bridge because all those people coming from those traditions, I can say, okay, look, you don't have to believe in all of Scripture, but check this book out and just allow this to connect, because a lot of people find Taoism appealing because of its emphasis on harmony and nature and Wu Wei and all these different things. So I've had, I would say probably at least 5 to 6 all guys that were non-Christian, kind of coming out of that general milieu that I just talked about. That's part of my corner of the internet. And they read that book, and it was very powerful for them because they could then take something that they've already appropriated and kind of like, and then see the bridge into the concept of logos, which is a person. This isn't the Greek philosophical concept of the unity of opposites, regarding Heraclitus. This is the second person of the Trinity. This is actually God incarnate. So I think that book is incredibly beneficial for anybody coming from that orientation and wanting to get a sort of preview of how we as Orthodox Christians can understand what Saint Justin Martyr refers to as logos spermatikos. Logos spermatikos, sperm equals seed. And so the idea is that there are seeds of logos all over creation. And even in the traditions that we spoke about today. So Hinduism, Buddhism, Daoism, Confucianism, as we already discussed in some of the apologetics, there's some of the things that they address that they get right. We as Orthodox Christians would say that is because of their utilization of logic and reason, and probably the personal virtue of the person who came up with the idea allowed for noetic clarity to come to the concept of something that is actually true. We would argue the problem with perennialism or the traditionalist school is that they then pick and choose all these pieces of all these world traditions and bring them together and say, look, they all mean the same thing. But if you put them back in their cultural and historical context and then compare them to this or this or this, you'll see actually there's a lot more differences. There's some subtleties, there's some overlaps, but there's a lot of differences. So orthodoxy says what we can do that the perennialist or the traditionalist school can't do is we have a singular epistemological framework, the logos epistemology, the church. And from that epistemological and moral framework, we can then look into the world, whether it be Nordic paganism or Amazonian shamanism or Islam or whatever it may be. And we can say, look, that's true, that not so much. And the Christ, the Eternal Dao, allows somebody to see. Now, maybe they would need a little bit more explanation on this concept, but they can see how the Orthodox Church is not just saying, oh, Taoism doesn't believe in Christ, it has nothing to say. We're saying, oh, look, here's Taoism. And of course, Father Seraphim Rose, who is the originator of that text, he was schooled by Alan Watts at the Asian School in San Francisco, and he could read Chinese, and he's the one that really wanted to do a sort of translation of the Tao Te Ching and put it in conversation with Orthodoxy. So people can read that book and begin to see, oh, Orthodoxy is actually engaging with all these things, and it's demonstrating where the bridges are and where the bridges aren't. And I think that's really efficacious for a lot of people.
Gotcha. So what are your thoughts on how these Eastern religions approach meditation? And I think specifically as it relates to our understanding of demonic activity, you know, speaking of Father Seraphim Rose, he makes the observation that he kind of draws the parallels between Kundalini yoga and being slain in the spirit with Pentecostals. That seems a little bit concerning. He talks about this in Orthodoxy and Religion of the Future, and also many Hindu gurus which claim to have esoteric knowledge. So where does that come from, and how do we approach meditation in contrast to these Eastern religions?
Well, first would be to recognize that spiritual warfare is in the imagination, right? So we already mentioned that. So orthodoxy, I don't think that, so I say that to preface this next statement that there's nothing wrong with meditation, because we would, as Orthodox Christian, we would call it contemplation. It's a really very similar concept. The major difference is the utilization of visualization techniques and what the meditation is for. Because we believe that you can open yourself up to demons through the mental images that you create, because the mind isn't within space and time. And angels and demons, we believe, are noetic entities, and the imagination is your noetic faculty. So wherever those entities are, it's in the same realm that your imagination is. That's a piece of you that's outside space and time. This is why you can think about the past and project into the future. There's a piece of us that's outside space and time, and this is the noetic dimension of us. So when we talk about meditation, the first thing is to realize that just sitting silently, which is a spiritual practice, sitting in silence is a major spiritual practice within Orthodox Christianity. It's the cessation of the senses, because we're so overly stimulated. And so sitting, contemplating on scripture, contemplating on prayer, contemplating on your spiritual life, sitting in silence, the ascetic lifestyle of denying yourself continual pleasure. These are things that we would absolutely agree with. But when it comes to like mantras, for example, like meditation, when you're depending on which tradition they're in, but all of them have mantras. And so they'll then repeat words to induce some type of, usually a visual or imaginative experience that can open them up to some type of spiritual gnosis or spiritual insight. So we would absolutely warn against anything like that. The mantras, the rituals, the visualizations. And this is one of the reasons why we would, and Father Seraphim Rose talks about it in Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, is yoga. Now, there's nothing wrong with the physical posture, like the physical stretching of yoga, right? That's great. That's healthy for you. The physical strengthening and physical attributes that are gained through yoga, like physical yoga practice, hatha yoga practice, there's nothing wrong with that. When I say, as I already said, yoga, there's a lot of different yogas, but when I say yoga, everybody thinks of the downward dog and all that stuff. So there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is, if you ever go and do yoga, that you'll find all these idols. So they'll have little Hindu gods, or Ganesha, which is the elephant-headed wisdom deity of Hinduism. He's the son of Shiva. And the symbolisms, the iconography of the environment, the mantras that people are saying, these we believe are opening up conduits for demonic activity. And this is why we would say yoga is demonic or something to stay away from. We're not retarded. We're not saying that, touching your toes is bad for you. We're talking about that yoga, as we just demonstrated, yoga means yoking, and the hatha yoga, these physical postures aligned with the visualization. So like the Sri Yantra mandalas and all this different stuff, the visualizations, the physical postures, the mantras, the prayers, this stuff is all an explicitly spiritual practice.
It's the combination
of all these things that now you may think that you got into it innocently, and maybe you did, but now all of a sudden you're doing, and whether you, this is why the Christians under the Roman Empire were sent to the Colosseum, because they wouldn't burn incense to the emperor. The emperor didn't care if they personally believed him to be a god or not. They just had to do the ritual. They had to do the practice. And this is where Orthodox would say, be careful. Because it doesn't matter about your intention when you're in the yoga studio. You're doing the ritual, and if you do the ritual, you can open yourself up to other powers. So we would say that yoga is much more than merely just a physical exercise, and there's nothing wrong. We absolutely value physical exercise and taking care of the temple of the body, but we would absolutely warn anybody about yoga, and that incorporates then meditation or something like that. And then you have these tantric practices. So I don't anybody who's ever heard of the left-handed path. So in Indian culture, you would typically wipe your rear with your left hand because you shake and you engage in the world with your right hand. And the right hand symbolized societal norms, the way that society was structured, and doing things the correct way. And there developed these traditions called tantric traditions or tantrism, where they would invert the societal norms as another way towards liberation. This is what I mean. Hinduism incorporates all this stuff. So another important school within Hinduism is a school that flips the orthodoxy in the exact opposite direction as another means for liberation. In the West, in an Orthodox Christian worldview, we would kind of describe that as Satanism or Luciferianism, because Satanism is about the direct inversion of Christianity. Luciferianism is, in a sense, the same thing, but Luciferianism more about an illuminated elite. So Luciferians are more about attaining the light, Lucius, Lightbringer, second sort of Prometheus figure, and keeping other ones in the dark to have power over those people. Satanism, though similar because it's all about power and the existential exertion of the will onto other people, Satanism is more explicit in regards to just the whatever Christianity says, do the opposite. And that's what Satanism. So my point is that it's very similar to Tantrism, but you have in Tantrism, they have all types of strange practices. So when you get into like these sexual rituals or the Kali cult in the Tamil tradition in southern India, Kali is a tantric deity. She's the wife of Shiva, who then goes crazy. She's bloodthirsty. It's like the ultimate feminist ideal. She's standing on the chest of her husband. She has a garland necklace of heads of men that she's killed. She has blood dripping out of her mouth. And this is the idea that, as opposed to the orthodoxy, right, of a woman being submissive, being married, being a mother, fulfilling her familial role. Kali, the tantric tradition, then takes the opposite of that and then blasts it up to 1,000. And that's what Kali represents. And so these tantric traditions are very, very different. And this is just like meditation, just like yoga. These are things to watch out for. And we would say ultimately it's a form of demonic cult. I mean, there's a famous tantric depiction of the Kali cult in one of the Indiana Jones movies. I forget which one that is. So one of the Indiana Jones movies they have where they had to sacrifice a human to Kali for her bloodthirstiness. And so very strange things, human sacrifice, sexual rituals, orgies. These things then are used as methods for spiritual illumination. But, there's all types of stuff, energy channeling, Reiki, mudras. Mudras are different, like symbols and stuff coming out of Hinduism and Buddhism that you can do with your hand. They believe that they can open your chakras up to different energies and illuminate oneself and that type of stuff. So Orthodox Christianity practices Hesychism. So that's our monastic tradition about inner stillness, prayer, the purification of the heart, the purification of our intentions, watchfulness. We call that nepsis, repentance, the sacramental life, confession, communion, and then asceticism, which both laity and monastics, though monastics to a higher degree, both participate in because we believe that denying of ourselves is actually spiritually uplifting and strengthening of us. So whether it be all these different Eastern spiritual practices that we talked about, Orthodoxy just has such a different approach to how one ascends their spiritual journey. And it is existential in the sense that we align our will with God, but it's not us that transforms ourselves. It's God's grace. It's God that allows that to happen. And so a big difference amongst these traditions that we've articulated is that we as Orthodox Christians do not make it happen. We do the duty. We meet God halfway, and then God does the rest. And that's part of the faith and why we put faith over reason. And so you can make rational arguments for a while you meet God halfway, but how God transforms you the other half is beyond rational comprehension.
Why do you think there is such a resurgent interest in them in the West today? Do you think that interest is purely organic, or do you think that is maybe possibly a little manufactured with, State Department or CIA push? I know Father Seraphim Rose talked about this, that there was a big push in the 60s for these Far Eastern religions in America suddenly. And I didn't know if you thought that was entirely natural or if there was some kind of, chicanery happening with that.
Both. So I guess to first address why they might be popular is, like you said, I think the first time a world religious fair was in Chicago in like the late 1800s. So that was like the first time I think an Indian guru was in America. I forget which one it was. Maybe it was Ramaswamy. These Eastern traditions really became much more popular after the 1960s and through the 60s counterculture. And so you mentioned the CIA. Would intelligence agencies want to utilize Eastern mystical traditions for ulterior purposes? Yeah, of course. Reason being is that if you believe that there was a project of globalism beginning at the 20th century, or really if you believe at any period in the 20th century, according to the writings of many of these globalists, the biggest obstacle that they had to overcome was Western traditionalism and especially traditional Christian believers. Because as we talked about, where China endorses traditionalism because it's what maintains the culture as it moves throughout space and time, we are elite. We're wanting to move the project in a new direction. We've talked about how the West has gone through all these intellectual developments, beginning with scholasticism and the Renaissance and humanism, and then the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the Enlightenment, all these different things. And the West has constantly been changing itself, and it perceives that this is like good, that as long as we're changing and moving forward, that somehow we're moving towards something better. And in that sense, if you're wanting to undermine American civilization or Western civilization, you would try to subvert Christianity or make it seem like it's not useful. And then you would bring in other spiritualities to so kind of fulfill replace the role and provide people with something of some type of alternative transcendent reality, if you will. And it incorporates multiculturalism because all these Western people then who have no ancestral lineage to these belief systems are incorporating new identities and new practices, which is part of the, really, as we talk about, the postmodern state. So the postmodern state of things is that there is no identity, right? I mean, being a nationalist is, I mean, you're right adjacent from being a fascist if you're a nationalist in one of these Western nations now. So I think that in the 60s, the organic dimension of the proliferation of these spiritualities is because, one, I believe the West was inundated with Western Christianity, which I personally believe Protestantism is going to die out in the next. I certainly don't see it continuing beyond 200 years, if we have 200 years. But certainly within the next century, I would see Protestantism being almost dead. Because at least in the Western nations, this young people just aren't converting to it. And it's just not at a replacement rate in regards to conversions. The average age of worship is like 65 and higher, depending on what the Protestant denomination is. Whereas in America, and this could be unfortunate, the religious practices that have young people under the age of 40 is the only Christian denomination was Orthodoxy. And then it's like Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. So those are the religions that are on an upward trend in America right now, because everything else is it's going to die out. And now Catholicism is getting a lot of young converts as well, particularly those that are focused on or emphasizing like traditional Catholicism. But you know, Pope Francis has just reposed, but Pope Francis banned the traditional Latin Mass. So even those that are converting to Catholicism for traditionality are being persecuted by the church itself right now, and they're trying to do away with that. But my point about why these Eastern traditions might be appealing is that because of the sort of static and perceived useless spirituality of Protestant Christianity, people are looking for something more mystical. And I would argue that Protestantism is more of an ideology. Now, I know it's a religion, and I know I have good Christian brothers and sisters that are Protestants, so I don't hate Protestants or anything. But as a spiritual religious worldview, there's very little dimension of mysticism. And this is why Pentecostalism has gone on the immense opposite end to like really emphasize mysticism at the expense of rationalism, because there isn't a genuine mystical encounter within Protestantism. And this is why you go to one of these mega churches and it's like overemphasized spectacle, stimulation, so that you can have some type of emotive experience. Now, I don't equate that as mysticism. Mysticism as a religious category has to do with a direct encounter with the transcendent entity. So it can be, you can have a mystical encounter with, you know, all religions talk about mysticism, but what mysticism is you're contacting something directly. Protestantism, because of its, go ahead.
Protestantism tries to induce that.
They try to induce it, but the system itself is so ideological. It's about a rational apprehension of Scripture. Right. It's about a rational proclamation of faith. It's like everything that's happening in the Protestant is happening up here. And I would argue this is why Protestants, when you talk to them about like, what are the big ills, it's like, well, it goes to communism, it goes to socialism, it goes to other ideologies. Because in a way, Protestantism is working on these other ideologies. It really is an ideology because it doesn't have a sacramental tradition that even occultism has. So if you're dealing with a true occultist, like a true satanic priest, or somebody's truly possessed, how can Protestant Christianity deal with that? It doesn't have a material dimension in which God plays a role. The Eucharist is totally symbolic, right? So Protestantism only exists like abstractly. It only exists in the mind. There is nothing tactile to hold on to except your Protestant Bible, maybe a King James Bible. That's about the only thing you can actually grasp. So because of that, these mystical traditions, these Eastern mystical traditions that we've all talked about, offer personal experience. I mean, maybe Confucianism not to the same degree, but certainly Hinduism, Buddhism, and Daoism offers a valuing of subjective experience that Protestantism doesn't find as important, at least doesn't present as important within its dynamic. And this was the true case for me. I mean, I grew up Protestant, but then once my rational faith, naive faith was shaken, now I'm into Eastern mysticism. I'm into, psychedelics and experiences, things that like, oh my gosh, are like kind of awe striking because I didn't find that where I grew up. So is the intelligence agencies in favor of promoting these non-Christian, non-Western identities? Absolutely, because I think that aids in creating a more divided culture, which can be more malleable by powers that be. If people are connected with sociologically what's called a sacred canopy, it's a concept developed by Peter Berger. Every culture has a sacred canopy, and within that canopy are the stories, are the legends, is the identity. It's all the heroes of that nation, and everybody, even if different races or whatnot, they have a same canopy of values, of stories, of people, of references. Our canopy in America, and really you could argue almost every Western nation, that sacred canopy has been ripped. And so there is no one thing that all Americans are unifying under. And so because there is no one thing, at least, if you, even 50 years ago, everybody, whether Democrat or Republican or whatever political, they'd still say, well, I'm American. Yeah, I want what's best. Now we have people literally advocating for the destruction of America, no wall, no barrier, no wall, no USA at all, right? This sort of Antifa mantra of total dissolution of all boundaries. So I think that the appeal to these traditions has to do with the novelty of them. They're new. There's an aura of the Far East that seems like they have something that we don't have. And if you're a Protestant, I would say you're probably right. They do have something you don't have. The faults of Western Christianity and its stultifying effects of Western nations. I mean, there is no formerly Protestant nation that you could still say is overtly Christian. I mean, you have in Britain, for example, I mean, you have the King James Bible, like Protestantism is the identity of Britain. And you have the Prime Minister or King Charles on Easter congratulating the Muslims, right? And on Easter, on Pascha, telling the Christians that basically Christians, the Jews, and Muslims all worship the same God. God bless the Muslims, and maybe we can all be more like them. And it's like, what? So even historically the most Protestant nation has no recognizable Christian dimension to it. Maybe some of the aesthetics, but the actual ethos of the country is totally gone. And this is why I would also argue why Orthodoxy is becoming more and more popular amongst the West, because it actually gives you a historical identity. Because, most Orthodox converts have already recognized the failures of the West, the failures of Protestantism, probably Catholicism as well, although there's usually still a conversation between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. But most converts to Orthodoxy would say, look, the historical trajectory of the West, look at where we're at. I can't buy a house. I can't find a wife. Immigrants are coming to my country and they get every benefit that I don't get. Like, who am I? What's my identity and what's my purpose? And Orthodoxy gives you a historical identity. It puts you rooted within a historical faith. It maintains all the boundaries. It's an unchanging faith. I mean, there's certainly clarifications throughout history in regards to doctrine and dogma, but we don't change it. That's the whole thing is, Father Josiah Trenum, one of his favorite jokes is, how many Orthodox does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is change. Because we don't want to change anything. The idea is that Christ and the apostles Christ revealed, the apostles formed the church, and if truth is eternal and truth is objectively true, truth is unchanging. And therefore, we don't want to change anything. And so, for the same reasons why Eastern mysticism is popular, I believe Orthodoxy is also going to gain in popularity because it actually allows you to maintain your Christian identity and gives you all the mysticism recontextualized from these Eastern traditions that we've talked about. It's certainly framed in a different way, but all the mysticism is still there. As we went through both the positives and the negatives of each of these traditions, we saw that each tradition had core elements that Orthodoxy agrees with, and core mystical dimensions. And so I think young people, especially young men, realizing that there is no forward path based on the trajectory of Western society, the only way out is back. And back means back before the schism, back to the original faith. And that gives a young man an identity, a transcendent belief system, a community to belong to, and something to die for. And I think that's not as talked much about, especially in the manosphere and the red pill sphere. But historically, men our age would have already died in battle, or still be in battle, or preparing to send their children in battle. And so a vast majority of young men died. A lot of men did not have children. Now we have a situation in which men and women aren't having children. And a lot of the men that, I'm not asking anybody to die in battle, but historically, a lot of the young men that probably would have already died in battle now have no place to go. There's nothing that the West is offering them. And so what is it? I think this is a big question. Again, the red pill or the secular manosphere doesn't really talk about, is like, what are you willing to die for? And if they push that question, they'd probably say, for my wife and my children. But as I've already highlighted, especially with the state right now in the West, not all the young men and not all the young women are going to get married and have children. There's a real problem at hand. And so what is your ultimate meaning? And I think for a man, you have to have something worthy to die for. And at least for me, once I found orthodoxy, that was the first time I felt like something that wasn't just my parents or my friends or my wife, that actually have something to defend and die for. That actually is, it is a ginormous purpose and responsibility for me in 2025, because this church, as I know you agree, it's existed since Christ, and it only exists into the 22nd century if we make it there, based on you and me actually upholding the faith and passing that on. So eventually you and I are going to be the old guy at the church, trying to tell the young kids like what we believe in the history. And I think that's something actually beautiful.
Yeah, for sure. That was a very beautiful motivational speech there. I'm going to have to keep that. When I'm feeling down, I'll rewatch it.
Thanks. Well, I didn't mean to moralize or anything like that. That was just my own.
No, it's good. It's good stuff. Okay, so are you familiar with the Esalen Institute? And if so, what is that?
Yeah. So the Esalen Institute, there's a book written by a gentleman named Jeffrey Kripal. I think it's Esalen, The Religion of No Religion is the name of the book. And it is probably, now it's coming at from a perspective, Jeffrey Kripal is a academic religious studies scholar in the United States, and he leads the GEM program at Rice University, which is Gnosticism, Esotericism, and Mysticism. It may be the only one. If it is, there's maybe only a couple in the United States, but these graduate programs where you can earn like a PhD in these like mystical or esoteric or Gnosticism, there's only a handful of these programs. Most of them are in Europe. But he was asked by the founders, at least the founder of Esalen Institute, Michael Murphy, and the Esalen Institute was founded in 1962 on top of a I think Esalen was the name of the Indians that resided there. So it used to be a place in which these Indian tribe used to live. I think they went extinct. I'm not sure. Don't hold me on that one. But anyways, Michael Murphy and his father, who was wealthy, they ended up purchasing the grounds, which is now the Esalen Institute. And he founded it with a gentleman named Richard Price, or Dick Price, is what he was commonly referred to. This is in Big Sur, California. It's a very, very beautiful place on the west coast of the United States. And it began essentially as a retreat center for the human potential movement. And so Aldous Huxley was one of the earlier speakers at the Esalen Institute. And he wrote the book, The Perennial Philosophy. And so he was a huge advocate of what's called the human potential movement. And his brother, Julian Huxley, is the founder of transhumanism. So his brother, Julian Huxley, who is the president of the Eugenics Society, they're both eugenicists. They wanted to perfect humanity through science, through gene editing and stuff like that. They both had this concept that man had to overcome himself. He had to become something much greater. Now, Esalen appropriated less the transhumanist, although it's now incorporated in part of it, but more about meditation, supernatural abilities, gestalt therapy, psychedelic exploration, these types of things for the advancement of human potential to attain supernatural potential that they believe is dormant within every human being. And this has to do with the building of like Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and so as we gain all the things that we need to live, we can become higher and higher advanced in our sort of human progression. So it became a hub of like New Age spirituality, Eastern mysticism, Western psychiatric practices, and really a place for the counterculture. So as I said, it began with, Aldous Huxley and a bunch of different, Timothy Leary spoke there, Alan Watts, Terence McKenna, Skinner, B.F. Skinner, the psychologist, tons and tons of people. If you look at their list of like prominent speakers throughout history, it's kind of a who's list. And so Esalen became essentially a laboratory for the concept of syncretism, which you can see, again, based on everything we've talked about with these non-dualistic worldviews. Now, we categorize Daoism as a monistic dualism because the inherent dichotomy within the Dao, but this approach, this focus on total unification is a very common spiritual ideal, and it comes out of Platonism. It's really we really inherit it through Neoplatonism. This idea that there's a realm of perfect unity that we need to unite with, and so this Platonic concept of unity, perfect unity, is part of this historical debate between the one and the many. Right? Is the concept of a chair more important than the actual chair I'm sitting in? And this is the difference between Plato and Aristotle. So Plato says, well, if we get rid of all the chairs on the earth and we still know the concept, the essence, the ideal form of what a chair is, well, we can make more chairs. Therefore, the one is more preeminent than the many manifestations of chairs. Aristotle would say, actually, I'm going to begin my philosophy by observing what the world actually does, induction. And he would say, I see the one chair, the many chairs right here. And through induction and then deducing truths from what I'm seeing, now I can come to the idea of what a chair is. So the approaches of the a priori Platonic ideal form versus the inductive approach of Aristotle, these are two opposite approaches towards philosophy, even though Aristotle was Plato's student. And so this has led to the perennial debate between the one and the many. Which one's more real? Orthodoxy says both. This is what makes our paradigm so unique. And so really, in my perspective as a philosopher, exquisite, wonderful. It's actually about pure metaphysical harmony. And so Esalen, like these Eastern mystical traditions, they emphasize unity over multiplicity. Right? The multiplicity is Maya. It's an illusion. It's not real. It's a figment. And ultimate reality is something totally unified and transcendent. And this concept is replete within Gnosticism, Neo-Gnosticism, contemporary Gnosticism, New Age spirituality. And so with the same thing with the Esalen Institute, then you can see this idea of unity transport itself into syncretism, into spiritual perennialism. Well, if unity is the truth, then we need to find the unity that accords with all religious traditions, and that must be the ultimate religion then, right? So Esalen was part and parcel of absolutely promoting that idea, and it was a major Western importer of Eastern mysticism into Western nations, most specifically the United States. And so in that sense, it's had a profound influence on the normalization of Eastern mysticism, the promotion of Eastern mysticism, and most specifically, I would say the Esalen Institute fuses Eastern mysticism with Western psychiatry or Western psychology. And in that sense, it takes Eastern mysticism and unifies it with Western psychological jargon to articulate basically a very similar paradigm.
Interesting. I didn't know all that. Okay, so last question. How does Orthodoxy fulfill the yearnings that cause people to turn to the Far East?
Well, I kind of mentioned this earlier. I would say, number one, people are looking for authentic experiences. I would say authenticity is a major element of contemporary culture. And so I think, getting a following has to do with being authentic. We're seeing all these, like Michelle Obama just created a podcast. Nobody watches it. Meghan Markle just created nobody watches it because these people aren't authentic. They're not like real people you can relate to. And so right now with the social media landscape, like people are desiring authenticity, and that comes with like authentic spiritual experiences. And if you've never had that, you're way more likely to try to fall into like Eastern mysticism or psychedelics or New Age spirituality. But Orthodoxy offers that mystical encounter and mysticism that people are looking for, like an explanation that isn't just rational. Now, a lot of people actually, that's their problem, right? So you do apologetics or debate with people. Maybe they'll say, "Oh, well, that's a cop out." You say, "Well, how could an uncreated God become a created man?" You say, "Well, that's a mystery. That's beyond my, any rational faculty." Like, "Oh, well, that's a cop out. That's not really answering the question." Well, all right. But then with our apologetics and like TAG or the transcendental argument for God, you can highlight that these people actually believe in a lot of things they can't rationally explain. Like if you're a materialist atheist and you believe that the world came from the Big Bang, how can you believe that the laws of logic, which are non-physical, are unchanging? Because based on their own paradigm, the only thing that exists is the material universe. The material universe is constantly changing. It's constantly in flux, noted by Heraclitus, 500 BC. You can never sit in the same river twice. And yet they appeal to logic and mathematics and number theory and all these different things to do science. And yet none of that stuff exists physically. So you can highlight that other people also believe in things that they can't rationally explain. But I think for some people they're actually looking for that because it's exhausting to try to rationally define everything, which you can't. It's a losing battle from the get-go. You can't. The Enlightenment has failed, right? Postmodernity exists because the intelligentsia, despite how depraved and debaucherous a lot of them are and stuff they believe, but they are right that the modernist project is ending. This is why we can feel the angst of nationalism versus globalism. We can feel these global wars. We can feel the technocracy. Like there's a force around us that is palpable, that is moving us towards this sort of unified global structure. And this is, again, where from an eschatological standpoint as Orthodox Christian, we'd say this is demonic because the Antichrist rules a one world government from Jerusalem. And the tentacles of our society is constantly moving towards this like global domination. So union with ultimate reality, union with ultimate meaning, I think is a huge thing that young people are looking for. Authentic experience, and Orthodoxy can offer that. Inner peace, right? So our cultures are filled with chaos right now. I mean, we can't even agree what a man and a woman is. And so people are looking for something that can offer them like inner peace, and they don't have to constantly try to figure everything out that's happening in the world. And I think the church it's an ark for that. It's an ark where people can go and they can like let their guard down and relax. You don't have to figure everything out. And really you can't anyways. And so I think that's another element that makes Orthodoxy appealing to young people. Dealing with the transcendence of death. Since 2020, as you know, Orthodoxy has seen a dramatic increase in the United States. Well, it's not even full 5 years. We'll say about a little over 4 years since 2020. Well, what happened? People were faced with death. Now we can question whether the man-made virus was actually, that deadly, but that's a totally separate question. The problem or the thing that happened is that people had to face the realization that maybe they will die. And if they did, I think that caused a lot of people to ask deeper questions about death and trying to figure out what happens when we die. Does life have a meaning? Is it just meaninglessness, or like the way you treat people, does it actually have meaning? And is there a judgment? I mean, all these religious traditions talk about a judgment, and even reincarnation from Hinduism and Buddhism is a form of judgment, because based on your karma, you're going to reincarnate one way or another. So almost every religious tradition has a form of judgment of the person based on their life that they live. And I think then people asking that question about themselves brings them to the church, and the church can kind of find a tranquility in regards to the problem of death, the healing of the inner self. So many people are traumatized by society, whether it be their parents or divorce or just circumstances of society, and that the Orthodox Church offers a place in which people can find inner healing and let go of their traumas and let go and find forgiveness. I mean, part of trauma, I believe, I'm no expert, I'm no psychologist, but part of it is that you don't relinquish your trauma until you forgive the person who traumatized you. And so you have to like forgive them at some point, like actually deeply in your heart. And that is the point of our Orthodox spirituality, because if you've already forgiven everybody, you know, you're not holding on to any of that stuff anymore. And that is for us a real form of detachment, not extreme detachment where you renounce your family, but a detachment where, you know, you renounce your pride, your ego. And sometimes, you know, people do you wrong and you still have to forgive them. And when you do that, you're actually empowered. It's kind of a paradox. And then, you know, finding meaning beyond the material world, it kind of relates to the previous points that I mentioned in regards to the appeal of orthodoxy. But people can feel that there's something deeper. And yet the operational ethos of Western society it's just materialism and it's consumerism. And if you consume enough material, you'll realize it doesn't satisfy. And so what is ultimately meaningful? I mean, this is really part of this larger debate that's happening with the red pill, with, you know, the 30-year-old woman who's now trying to get married. It is a phenomenon. And yes, there's jokes and there's memes and all this different stuff. But really is what's happening is people trying to figure out what is ultimately meaningful, and all the pleasure, all the sex, all the experiences, all the fun and the parties and the nightclubs that may have seemed meaningful in the moment, but now you're 30 something and you don't really have anything to show for it. And so for young men, they're finding the only thing that's meaningful is your purpose and developing a competent skill set and then having a family, because the competent skill set and the purpose provides money, which allows you to provide for the wife and the children, which is your duty and responsibility as a man and a Christian father. And so it's pretty simple from that perspective. Like, if you want meaning, you got to find your purpose and you got to develop a skill set. And then, which is out of your control, somebody to love you, you love somebody, and then you build that family together. Outside of that, and of course, God is the number one thing in regards to meaningfulness. I'm taking that for granted there. I'm assuming everybody realized that as an Orthodox Christian. But
all these things descend.
Yes, everything descends from God, but those things are really important. And so it's not this complicated thing about your Bugatti and how many followers you have. It's about your purpose, your skill set, and then your wife or your husband, and then your children, and your church and God. And outside of that, everything maybe has meaning, but it's not the source of meaningfulness in the ultimate sense. And so the people come to the church and then they realize that that's exactly what the priest is saying, that, oh, all the young guys, I come to fellowship after the Orthodox Church and they're all, you know, as the kids say, based. They're all red-pilled. They all get what's going on in culture. And we're all looking and trying to move ourselves towards the same goals and the same desires. And that's reassuring, because as the sociological research has showed, that young people right now in the 21st century are the most isolated ever recorded. They have the least amount of friends. They go on the least amount of dates. They do the least amount of communal activities. And they spend most of their time online, which is a facade of personal engagement. I mean, it's useful. Orthodoxy spreading. I use it. We're all on social media, but that's not real community, and that's not real people. That's why you got to go to a parish. And if you're not a Christian, if you're not in a church, I mean, where do you find your community? The bowling club? Like, what, you have to find something that unites people, and then you have to be part of that group. But like, for young people, what group do they join? The Boy Scouts, where now there's girls and boys in it because they can't say no to girls. Like, where do people go to join a community? And then we have so many broken families. It's not like you come from a family, at least some people. It's not like they come from a family that's intact, where they can at least have their identity and their loved ones and their community there. So people are totally isolated. But if they join the church, they are given a community. And it may not be the people that you normally hang out with, but that's the point of the spiritual growth. is the old lady or the people your age or the middle-aged woman with children. All you guys are there for the same reason, which is Jesus Christ and the Orthodox Church. And then you take on responsibilities. The church needs you to do this. They need you to do that. You're there. You're participating. You're helping out with the parade or the festival or whatever they got going on. And now you have a sense of belonging and you have a community that you're responsible to. And it's people, it's not you choosing. This isn't consumerism, right? You don't get to choose, well, I want to be in a community and I want everybody to be like this. And then that's not how it works. You get the community that you're supposed to get. And this is where we work out our salvation then inside the parish with the hodgepodge of people who are all broken, just like we are. And we're all struggling and we're going to struggle together. And that gives you meaning and that gives you a purpose and that gives you life that you really can't find anywhere. And that all leads to my last point, which what Orthodoxy offers is personal transformation. And it's not easy. And so, and even when you become Orthodox, it's not like the next day after your baptism, every sinful temptation that you deal with is just washed away. And now some people have that experience. I've known people that have had that experience. I did not have that experience. I had the opposite. If everything that I wanted actually became way worse and it became more tempestuous, which is very normal because when you do your baptism and chrismation, you turn and spit on the devil. You literally spit on Satan and basically tell him game on, like I'm now on the opposite team. And a lot of people, especially young men particularly, I've spoke about this with this priest on my YouTube channel. It's mostly young men because of the potential that they can offer society if they move in the right direction that have the most difficult time after their baptism. But that's not something to shy away from. That's something to embrace because it means you're going in the right direction. And so this personal transformation is not just one mystical encounter like a psychedelic experience in the woods and now you're a different person the next day. You are, but you work on it all the time. And so many times you feel like you're the old person you used to be, but then you find strength to not do things that you used to do. And you see how you're transforming as a person, the way you treat people, the way you talk people, your desire to attend church and God and the sacraments. And so the ultimate endpoint of what people are looking for is personal transformation. And people find this in apotheosis of these Luciferian Gnostic theologies in which they worship themselves. That's still the same thing of they're trying to transform themselves from who they are into something greater. The human potential movement of the Esalen Institute is trying to transform themselves. They're all misguided, though. It all ends in self-worship, which is the problem of our culture. If we're already isolated, and the term devil is diabolos, meaning to throw things apart, to separate, to isolate. Well, then if your personal transformation is just further continuation of your narcissism and self-worship, you're doing exactly, from our Orthodox Christian perspective, you're doing exactly what the devil would want you to do because suicide is the ultimate end of total isolation. And that's ultimately what the devil wants for all of us, is to kill ourselves. And we do it through our own sins. We do it through our addictions. We do it through our, all our tempestuous pleasures, is that every time we engage in sin, we are slowly killing ourselves. The difference is once you get up and you repent and you go to confession and you take this act, you've got back up and you've kind of washed yourself. And you can start fresh again. And so you're given new life. If the sin kills you, the sacraments and the participation and the uncreated energies, they rejuvenate you. And that's the continual ebb and flow of the Orthodox Christian life. So we don't believe in this proclamation of faith. And if I do an altar call in 1985, that I'm saved in 2025, despite the life that I've lived for the last 40 years. That's not how this works. Every day and every decision is influenced. The difference is we don't believe that your name is on a list at the pearly gates and that they're going to say, hey, Joe Smith, sorry, you're not on here. You're out of here, bud. You got to go down there. We are choosing our salvation right now. You and I are choosing our salvation. Every day is a choice. And from that understanding, it puts the onus on us. And so all that existential dimension of this mystical encounters and these theologies we've talked about, we can find that existential flavor. But again, we're only going halfway. We're not transforming ourselves. We're just meeting God where God is. And so we have to existentially do that. But in that process, we become something much greater. We become something closer to Christ. And until you personally go on this journey, nothing I say or anybody can say can make this a reality. And this is part of this is why subjectivity is actually very important within religion, is that there's so many things that have happened to me since being Orthodox that have confirmed the journey that I'm on and confirmed my faith in Christ, that if I were to explain that to somebody, it'd sound dumb. It wouldn't make sense. If we're going to use Jungian psychological terms, it's the synchronicities. But from a Christian perspective, it's the providence. It's these instances that happen that your internal life, your prayer life, your desires, and your relationship with God, in a way, manifest themselves through weird and strange encounters in your life. That okay, this is a sign for me to perpetuate my faith, to continue on the journey. And those are the things that you can't tell people. You can't explain it to people. You want to. I mean, I have close friends that, they're not Orthodox. They're lifelong friends. And no matter how much I want to tell them about my experiences, that's not going to give them the faith. The only thing that does it is once an individual says, you know what, I believe, I'm going to go through with this, and I'm going to see what happens. And then these things happen to them. And now they have the faith that, again, they can't be given to you. It's like you have to earn it in a way. Now, some people are graced with faith. And, and many of our saints were graced with different gifts. But faith can also be a gift. Some people are given more faith than others. But also, faith is something that is worked out by actually living the life and then seeing these strange, amazing, providential, synchronistic occurrences that come afterwards, and then revalidate the journey that you're on and reaffirm that where you're going is where you need to go, and to not slow down.
I definitely don't have anything to add to that, but one point that I did want to elucidate, because you brought this up earlier, is I think one of the major things that draws people to those Far Eastern religions is the mysticism that they're missing in a lot of the Western context of Christianity. But in Orthodoxy, you have that mysticism with the properly oriented metaphysic of Christianity.
Exactly.
And it's not oriented towards the self like these other religions. It's oriented towards God. There is the hierarchy that you have in some of these other religions, but it's oriented properly. The hierarchy is correct, and things filter down and scale up and down properly.
Right.
And to be like, at risk of oversimplifying it, it's actually true. It's the truth.
Right. For me to get to the place to say that, just like you said, that took personal experience. Like, that took me going on the journey that you can say that so confidently without people be like, well, that's just your opinion. And you're like, okay, from your perspective, I could see why you'd say it's just my opinion, but I'm telling you, if you go and you do these things, like you will see that it's the truth. This is the truth.
Yes.
And to your point, epistemologically, like, I just got into some of the doctrinal apologetics. I didn't get into like the epistemological apologetics against Buddhism and Hinduism, is that you could highlight that their concept of Maya, and that your experience of reality is an illusion, calls into question objective truth claims itself. So to your point, Orthodoxy allows mysticism, but also then allows the entire metaphysical foundation of what built Christendom and even continued in Western civilization up until really the Enlightenment. Kant and his critique of pure reason, I think, is the total undermining of the traditional metaphysics, and that's what the 1800s. And so from there forward, we no longer have the traditional metaphysics that our civilization was built on, but Orthodoxy has the mysticism that the West doesn't have, but it has the traditional metaphysics that the East doesn't have. And together, this is why it is the perfect synthesis. And Orthodox, if you love the both and, Orthodoxy is, Constantinople is the meeting point between the West and the East. That is historically what it was. And I think Orthodoxy still is theologically the meeting point between the West and the East.
Yeah, the West and the Far East. Yeah, and also one other thing is that and this kind of goes back to like the whole thesis of my video from last year, is that all of these religions have something to say about Jesus. At the end of the day, it boils down to, who do you say that I am?
Exactly. And then they're all going to say that he's either a bodhisattva, or he was a guru, or he was a great moral and ethical teacher.
Right.
And that's not who he said he was.
Exactly. And that's what everyone says.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like,
even Richard Dawkins says that. That doesn't mean much.
You only have really like 2 or 3 positions on Jesus. Like, either he was who he says he was, or he wasn't. He was just a good moral teacher. You know, you got some mythicists that say it didn't exist.
Right. That's really, that's really your three avenues.
Yeah. Well, that's all I've got. David Patrick Harry, thank you for illuminating us on these Far Eastern religions. And I know I'm going to have to definitely listen back and reabsorb some of this. So for people who want to learn more or check out what you're doing, obviously I'll have your channel linked. Is there anything that you want to plug before we end off?
No, other than you can find, if you want to check out more of my work, you can find me at Church of the Eternal Logos. And I will be defending my dissertation here. Now, I know this will be out in the future. So by the time this is out, I should have a book titled Rebuilding Babylon, at least that's the working title, on my dissertation comparing technological deification and transhuman eschatology, the singularity, with Eastern Orthodoxy, theosis, and our eschatology. And so that should be available. My plan is by the end of May, that will be for sale. So that's kind of the main focus for me, is to get that published. And I'll be actually rebranding my old YouTube channel that used to promote psychedelics. I had that channel, it was almost at 100,000. It was like 196,000 when I became Orthodox and privatized all the videos that promoted psychedelics that made that channel. And and since then, I've been kind of dual streaming for the last year my Church of the Eternal Logo streams, which are all Orthodox oriented. And so I've lost about 20,000 subs or so over on that channel, which was the point. And so I'm going to be taking everything down off that channel and kind of rebranding it and making it a place for not explicitly Orthodox apologetics, but more for a general audience. So talking about cultural topics and keeping them, like 10 to 30-minute videos, and doing interviews with a lot of people. Right now, almost everybody that comes on my YouTube channel are Orthodox priests or Orthodox Christians. And so I want to open it up where it's not Church of the Eternal Logos. That's going to be my educational platform. Which I love to do. I love to do research and I love to present information. I'm going to keep it for that. And the other one's going to be engaging more with people that just may not be in this corner of the internet, and talking about topics more generally, and trying to branch out and try to reach mostly young men coming from that perspective, red pill, manosphere, conspiracy theory, that type of stuff.
Yeah, I've thought about doing the same thing, but I need to slow down because I have way too many projects.
Yeah, I feel you there. Well, I appreciate you having me on, brother. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for joining me.